Dr. Stephen Strange is a renowned neurosurgeon who, after being involved in a car crash, suffers debilitating injuries. His exhaustive search for a cure leads him to Kamartaj, where he learns the art of sorcery. Using his previous skills for study and his thirst for knowledge, he quickly develops his skill as a sorcerer, eventually using the Time Stone to defeat the interdimensional villain Dormammu. With the Ancient One passing, Doctor Strange becomes the Sorcerer Supreme, tasked with protecting the realm of Earth from mystical threats. Later on, we see Doctor Strange do exactly this in Thor Ragnarok. With Thor and Loki arriving on Earth to search for their father, Doctor Strange apprehends the trickster who formerly attempted to invade Earth. Within mere minutes, Doctor Strange captures Loki, speaks to Thor to ascertain his mission, comes up with a solution, and then executes his plan so that the Asgardians leave Earth as promptly as possible, ensuring that there is little chance for conflict to spill out on Earth. In Spider-Man Homecoming, he has no qualms with sending each interdimensional villain back to their point of origin, even if it means their demise, so he can ensure no innocent people are hurt.
In the grand calculus of the multiverse, their sacrifice means infinitely more than their lives.
So, when Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, takes over an entire town and psychologically tortures its inhabitants for weeks using magic, astute fans of the MCU wondered why Doctor Strange never appeared to stop the Scarlet Witch, given the MCU is an interconnected universe. Well, eventually the answer was given. It was not that the writers forgot, as many might assume, it was actually an intentional decision. The reasoning was this, quote, "We didn't want the end of the show to be commoditized to go to the next movie. Here's the white guy. Let me show you how powers work." What? It's absurd that a franchise built in part because of its interconnected universe would prohibit the most relevant character appearing because Doctor Strange is a white man. This writing decision was made in part due to the politics of the people at the time, using some hyper-progressive intersectional frameworks that dictates what character can show up and what can't based off the character's identity, rather than, the actual lore that the MCU built. Ostensibly, if Doctor Strange was not a white man, then the character could show up, meaning that it was Doctor Strange's identity as a white man that prohibited him from appearing in the story where previous MCU entries established that he absolutely would show up, leaving the writers of Multiverse of Madness in an odd situation, attempting to untangle a mess from the film's inception, which resulted in Doctor Strange forgiving Wanda because she stopped torturing people, leaving behind the logic that if you do magically torture people so long as you eventually stop, then Doctor Strange would be okay with it. This writing is diametrically opposed from what we have seen of Doctor Strange. Because the writers placed in part political considerations before narrative ones, they not only led the second Doctor Strange film to a downward path, they also damaged his character. And make no mistake, dictating what characters can and cannot show up based on immutable characteristics when previously the MCU dictated who could make an appearance and who wouldn't based on lore is a political decision, and it was the wrong decision to make. In Critical Drinker's video analyzing the 2024 film Speak No Evil, a remake of the 2022 Dutch film The Guest, Drinker goes on to state that several decisions made towards the end of the Hollywood remake led to a substantial dip in quality.
The remake, on the other hand, goes off in a completely different direction that not only misses the point of the original movie, sacrificing the dark and thought-provoking ending for a generic chase and fight sequence that goes on for too long, but also fails to resolve any of the film's main character arcs, and in some cases actually manages to contradict them.
Drinker asserts that the idea of having the family fight back and defeat the perpetrators undercut the poignant themes contained in the original Dutch film. The bleak and haunting nature of the original ending, which aided the themes and commentary about the overly polite nature of some individuals in today's society, is not served by the story decisions made in the 2024 version.
When they're forced into a ditch to be executed, Bjorn's final line to Patrick underscores the entire point of the movie. Why are you doing this? Because you let me. This is the core message of the film. Bjorn and Louise weren't prisoners. They could have left at any time they wanted, but even when they were clearly uncomfortable, even when their hosts were becoming weird and aggressive and they knew that something was wrong, they chose to stay rather than cause a fuss. They were weak and cowardly, and because of that, they lost everything. It's a powerful critique of the permissive culture we live in today, where we're conditioned to accept and tolerate even the most absurd and ridiculous behaviour, where offending strangers is somehow seen as worse than putting our own loved ones in danger, where people are told not to fight back or stand up for themselves. And in a more specific sense, it's an examination of what happens when traditionally masculine traits like assertiveness, protectiveness, and even aggression are systematically bred out of men, to the point where they're no longer even capable of being protectors and providers. And in the end, it costs him everything. It's a grim but very thought-provoking ending to a movie that has a lot to say for itself.
'Cause, Critical Drinker doesn't talk about theme. Going further, Drinker then criticizes the film for having the wife fight off the perpetrators while the husband sits behind cowering in fear, unable to act.
And I kid you not, Ben hides in a cupboard while Louise girl bosses her way through the entire encounter.
Drinker gives the setup and background of the general dynamics within the family, most notably that the husband has an inability to stand up for himself and is a pushover. The relationship is also strained due to the wife's past infidelity. The general arc of the film Drinker proposes is one in which the husband learns to stand up for himself and his family over the course of the narrative, and at the end takes his mantle as the person responsible for the family and its safety, ensuring that the traumatic incident leads to the husband stepping up.
A logical character arc would have seen him realise that weakness and passivity isn't going to work on a guy like Paddy, and the only way to survive is to finally grow a spine, act like a fucking man, and do whatever it takes to protect his family. It would also feed into the overall message that his weakness in all aspects of his life is what really caused this to happen, and that maybe now he's finally ready to be the man he's supposed to be.
However, by having the odd choice of the woman fighting back, there is little progression. The husband stays squarely in place and does nothing. The wife will have her poor perception of her husband reinforced, and the relationship will not continue much further, given its unsteady nature and the confirmed unreliability of the husband. The odd and unconventional decision not only robs the film of its original theme and striking ending, the altered version does little to give each character a convincing arc, instead leading to an unsatisfying ending that reinforces where the characters were at the start of the film, all for having the girl boss scene. In Little Platoon's and Nerdrotic's review of War of the Rohirrim, a large part of the review focuses on the character of Hera. Yes, they obviously discuss other elements. However, Hera receives quite a bit of focus. The reason is that Hera is almost an entirely fabricated character, whereas in Tolkien's novel, she's not even given a name and mentioned in passing. In War of the Rohirrim, she becomes the main character, robbing other actual characters of their moments and focus.
Like wildly deviating from the lore, making up characters that end up subverting the characters that are actually written in the story, and they couldn't possibly go with a girl boss, could they? Well, now that I've seen the film, they went with a girl boss.
This decision was a blatant change made to Tolkien's lore in an effort to appeal to the modern audience, those who take significant issues with Tolkien's lore and world given the lack of its modern-day representation and themes. And instead of honoring and doing their best to adapt said work faithfully, these individuals decided instead to bend his writing to their morals and politics, compromising the narrative in the process. Although Philippa Boyens has always held these beliefs, whereas once she was checked by other creatives, here her philosophy and approach were left unconstrained, leading to this mess.
Yeah.
I've been going back and reading a lot of the interviews from people like Philippa Boyens and what was said after the original trilogy, and I quite frankly think we're lucky to have got what we got in the first place, because their comments about it prove that they were 100. There was even one bit where they're like, no, the thing with the Eowyn bit, that brought an entire different audience into the movie, which really lifted up Lord of the Rings to where it was. And they often talk about how they need to bring like more of a female audience, more female values into the whole thing. And these were all interviews back in like 2004. So you take that personality trait and drag it 20 years into the future, and they've just got more and more extreme as they've gone along with everything.
In her writing, she's appealing to people who are fundamentally opposed to much of what Tolkien wrote, and in an effort to glob onto a popular IP, will demand changes to any and all aspects of the lore to fit their own ideal, attempting to canonize their idea of what Middle-earth should have always been. Nerdrotic and Little Platoon not only explore this topic, they give specific examples of how things have been altered to shoe in Hera, in some cases robbing other characters of their own deeds.
Now, War of the Rohirrim had plenty of time to flesh out named characters in the appendices like Helm's sons, Haleth and Hama. Unfortunately, that would take away time from the completely made up by Warner Brothers characters. Is this starting to sound familiar? And unfortunately, they're both relegated to not even guest star status, barely side character status.
Hera as a character is also criticized given how competent she is at almost everything, leaving behind a fairly unmemorable character.
A rather amusing video on YouTube in which Philippa Boyens explains that the writers had no interest in portraying Hera as a warrior princess because they thought that was a tired trope. I found myself recalling this quote when, having seen her best Moomakill, train eagles, be right about everything, kill trolls, and save Helm's Deep, I watched Hera at the close of the movie taking on and defeating the villain of the piece while wearing a wedding dress. The writers avoided the warrior princess trope like they're Caitlyn Jenner avoiding all those poor people she ran over. At the close of her totally not warrior princess coded introduction, Hera feeds an eagle, and this will become very important later. As for who Hera is beyond her embarrassing list of unforgettable yet somehow forgotten deeds, she has about as much character as anybody else in this movie, which is to say, not a lot.
Which leads to an ultimately incoherent ending where the narrative attempts to solve the problem as to why you never heard of Hera in the Middle-earth given her legendary feats, where Hera decides to abandon any responsibility to her people and just fucks off into the sunset. In an effort to correct Tolkien's mistake, the writers inserted a strong female character and thrust her into the middle of the story, leading to an underwhelming protagonist, a failure to capture Tolkien's original story, and leaving fans disappointed by delivering an alternate set of events not nearly as compelling as the original, just in order to have the girl boss protagonist.
The word girl boss genuinely doesn't escape my lips that often, but there is no other word to describe our protagonist here. She has the distinction of being the most pronounced but hardly the most well-drawn of all the characters. Her arc is a flat line, from precociously talented and fierce wise warrior who is always right, to precociously talented and fierce wise warrior who was always right.
War of the Rohirrim ended up being a forgettable film, leading Helm Hammerhand to be no more than a footnote in the larger cultural zeitgeist. When Battlefield 5 was announced, the reveal trailer drew scrutiny due to it featuring a woman in infantry combat on the front lines of World War II under the Western Allied forces. Something which did not happen. In Rag's video regarding Battlefield 5, he goes on to explain why people would demand a game be set in World War II, most notably immersion.
Oftentimes, it is the limitations of technology that lend themselves to gameplay mechanics or to the experience one gets from immersing themselves in a time period. There's a definite difference in the feel of a game that takes place in the medieval ages to one that would take place in a far futuristic science fiction setting. You could ask a dozen people and maybe get a dozen different answers, but the reason why people want a game that is set in World War II is because they want a game that accurately, or at least believably, portrays World War II.
And how the inclusion of women in this context breaks that immersion.
Either way, the response to this seems to be, oh yeah, well that might be unrealistic, but so is X, Y, and Z. And then we get into the whole rabbit hole of, these games aren't realistic. They're trying to be immersive and, to an acceptable degree, authentic. Something can be aesthetic, right? And impact the player. Just because it doesn't have an impact on gameplay, doesn't mean that something can't have an impact. Something can be purely aesthetic and remove immersion. It can impact how the player feels about the game. And if a player is looking for the feeling of a World War II game, then having women with one arm and face paint on the front lines of British forces in World War II is obviously going to have a huge impact, because that's ridiculous, and it's ridiculous at face value. Luke is actually apparently making the argument here that as long as it doesn't affect the statistics and the numbers and the gameplay that's happening, anything can look like anything, and anything can sound like anything, and there should be no problems at all. So if all of the Battlefield soldiers were dressed as clowns, and they spoke, I don't know, Persian, then that's fine, because it doesn't impact gameplay, it only affects aesthetics.
And that the defenses of this inclusion made little to no sense to anyone familiar with shooters and the Battlefield franchise.
When he says the series has never been based on anything approaching historical accuracy, he's just fucking flat out wrong. That's why there are no AK-47s in a game set in World War I, and how come flamethrowers are not depicted in modern conflicts. It's the same reason why there are no holographic gun sights in World War II games, and why there are no remote-controlled surveillance drones in Vietnam. Every single game that Battlefield has in the series has a level of historical accuracy to it that doesn't compromise on the overall integrity of the experience.
In a different video, Griffin Gaming discusses the reasoning behind the inclusion and how one of the developers did not want to tell his daughter that she couldn't play any in-game characters that looked like her.
Revisit some of the main lines from Alan Kurtz's politically charged statement on Reddit addressing the same issue. I knew this was going to be a fight when I pushed for female soldiers in Battlefield. I have a daughter, and I don't want to ever have to answer her question of, why can't I make a character that looks like me, with, because you're a girl. I fundamentally feel to my core this is the right way, and I will find myself on the right side of history. And I think many people will play the game despite their reservations, and maybe learn something either about history or themselves. This is part of making games art. I can't.
After the game was released, other creators went on to discuss the Nautilus section of the campaign. The game depicted a lone woman and her mother destroying the Nazis' manufacturing plant of heavy water in Norway. The main issue is that this was entirely fabricated.
There are many different examples of these inaccuracies, but I have to say that perhaps the most egregious one in all of this is the campaign mission in which you are playing as the Norwegian saboteurs. Because you're not playing as the Norwegian saboteurs who managed to stop German heavy water production that was leading to a nuclear bomb program. No, instead the entire historical operation is performed by one woman. And like, that's it. An elite group of 11 men trained specifically for this role? Nope. One woman.
The developers were so focused on including women in the game, they erased actual people's contributions and sacrifices on the altar of inclusion. These were not the quote-unquote untold stories of World War II that DICE said, tales of heroism and conflict lesser known in the Isles of History. These were the untold stories of World War II because they never happened. The developers were so insistent to have inclusion that they fabricated history instead of telling the story of what actually happened. because I guess it made them feel bad. When pushback occurred, the media called it sexist, and later on higher-ups at DICE stated, if you don't like it, don't buy it. Battlefield 5 went on to sell substantially less copies compared to the previous game, and lapsed behind Call of Duty once again.
Like when people criticized its historical inaccuracy, the response from the company was, oh, well, if you don't like it, don't buy it. Like, yeah, that's exactly what happened then.
Each individual instance is an example of anti-woke criticism, in TV, film, and games. In these cases, the creators criticize some aspect of the storytelling, and subsequently went on to criticize the reasoning behind many of those decisions that led to an inferior story, not just simply bad writing or execution, but when ideology actively prevents what should naturally take place or insert elements that do not belong. Recall the first example when Doctor Strange should have made an appearance and didn't, and recall the last example when the developers inserted women in contexts contrary to history. This is not just incompetence. These decisions were actively made to contort the story to fit the creator's politics instead of letting the natural story continue, ignoring lore, precedents, and logic. A YouTuber by the name of OtterlyNoah recently made a series of videos criticizing this approach that many on YouTube use. And as someone who does employ this style of critique, I found some of the arguments to be flawed in nature and coded with double standards. I do not disagree with all of his points, as an understanding of when to deploy anti-woke criticism is oftentimes half the battle, and when it's employed in the wrong context, it is often easily rebutted, which on a few occasions OtterlyNoah does. Given the sheer volume of all the videos, I will only be covering the portions that I find relevant. If you wish to see the full video for the full context, I will put the link in the description below. Without further ado, let us begin.
What an anti-woke film critic does is more or less detract from any real sort of criticism with a film by usually picking out characters of a certain race, sexual orientation, or something else that makes them somewhat of a minority. Instead of discussing things like pacing, or storytelling, or cinematography, the things you should discuss when critiquing a film, for every Patrick H. Williams, you get a critical drinker, one of these awful, really shallow critics who just can't analyze a film beyond anything involving DIE.
But these critics do criticize these things. You can focus on the parts you disagree with, but many of them criticize writing, visual effects, acting, editing, amongst all other aspects of film. OtterlyNoah does not showcase these parts, but they do.
The fight scenes are decent, even if they go on a bit too long and get to be a bit samey at times. The plot is simple and serviceable, even if it takes too long to get going and relies a bit too much on convenience to keep moving. On the plus side though, it avoids most of the convoluted nonsense that bogged down John Wick 3 and 4 and keep things much more streamlined. Eve herself is a sympathetic protagonist with an understandable motivation, but a bit light on personality and without the mystique and dark menace of Wick himself. The unpleasant truth here is that Final Reckoning is a real mess of a movie, with a bloated and fragmented storyline that tries to juggle way too many plot devices, weighed down by stodgy exposition dumps that go on forever and mostly reiterate stuff that we already know, and featuring some of the most confusing and nonsensical editing choices in the whole franchise. It's more like a whistle-stop tour of the big moments in Napoleon's life, giving you just enough to understand what's happening at that precise moment, but lacking the wider context needed to explain why it matters so much. The reasons for Napoleon's endless wars with Britain, Spain, and Prussia are never really explained. His campaign in Egypt and his reasons for returning to Europe are either glossed over or completely fabricated. Even his invasion of Russia, the major turning point in his life and career, is only given a couple of lines of vague dialogue to justify it.
The contention is when they speak about hot-button pop culture topics, which will be discussed later, but to pretend as if their discussions or reviews are purely on one topic, ignoring all other relevant factors, is disingenuous. OtterlyNoah doesn't really present the honest case. He's instead tackling the shadow of the strawman he himself created.
He often takes aim specifically at things made under Disney, most notably Star Wars, Marvel, and often Disney live-action remakes, since there's obviously very easy shots to take there. However, rather than talking about specifically what makes certain projects made under Disney, specifically Star Wars and Marvel stuff, actually bad, such as the fact a lot of them are very rushed out and there's a big issue with oversaturation, and the fact that not a lot of time is actually put into these projects usually because Disney demands around 7 Marvel projects per year, he just takes a very superficial look at all of it and decides, oh, the introduction of quote-unquote wokeness must have made these projects unsuccessful, and have rather poor reception. When, no, that really isn't the case, and oftentimes he'll just contradict himself on this as well.
This is not even what you were asking for. Discussing the meta context of a film's production and the larger business practices of Disney when it comes to content creation and the rushed timeline is not the in-depth discussion of any specific film's artistic quality.
However, rather than talking about specifically what makes certain projects made under Disney, specifically Star Wars and Marvel stuff, actually bad,
you yourself just started discussing general topics and the rush nature of Disney content rather than evaluating any specific film's quality in the realm of acting, pacing, writing, editing, or anything similar. You just failed your own bar. But more importantly, is your absurd claim that Critical Drinker has not talked about these specific things when he actually has multiple times throughout a variety of his videos.
2. Quantity over quality. In the first 3 phases, Marvel released a total of 23 movies over more than 10 years. That's an average of just 2 per year. For comparison, Phase 4 alone saw the release of no less than 15 movies and TV shows in the space of just 2 years. And the result is that it just became fucking exhausting for audiences. Every few weeks it felt like there was another Marvel product shat out into cinemas and Disney Plus, and the more it happened, the less meaningful it became. And if it was bad for audiences, then a punishing workload like this was even worse for the people actually working on it. Even a studio as big as Marvel can only develop so many projects at the same time before the quality starts to slip, and that's exactly what happened. Everything from the writing to the directing to the special effects began to go downhill as the phase ballooned in size and scope. The films that had once seemed so slick and polished began to feel rushed, clumsy and incomplete. And if they were bad, then the TV shows were even worse. Basically what I'm saying is that they tried to do too much too quickly, spreading their time and resources too thin, and the result was something had to give. And that thing turned out to be the quality of their products. They wanted more, and fast. And so pretty soon, the floodgates were opened and the sludge began to flow. Book of Boba Fett was a rushed, cheap, and ultimately pointless adventure featuring an old, overweight, and incompetent revision of a classic character.
Not only 10 minutes in are we lying about the Critical Drinker's content.
In this video, however, he claims that Revenge of the Sith and the rest of the prequels were actually seen as good upon their release because of the pretty visuals, and later on, in his words, they became hated because of video essays tearing them apart.
At first everyone loved it because they were hyped by the Star Wars legacy and the pretty visuals, but then came the YouTube video essay era where it became fashionable to make hour-long videos shitting all over the prequels, and now that we're trapped in the festering swamp of the Disney era, the rose-tinted glasses are coming out and people are starting to look back more favourably on the prequel trilogy.
And supposedly, now that Disney is in charge of Star Wars and spreading the quote-unquote message, now people see Revenge of the Sith as good again, and the prequels overall, when in actuality, this was never the case. This is just misinformation. The prequels were completely lambasted upon release, with many old fans of the original trilogy getting extremely heated. Drinker is just blatantly incorrect about this, but he tries to claim that the prequels were seen as good at some point in time around their release just to fit his narrative for his reasoning on why the Disney Star Wars stuff doesn't seem to resonate with people. Well, fun fact, Drinker, the prequels didn't resonate with a lot of fans of the original trilogy, so there. His takes on media are so bottlenecked in order to meet his own agenda of rage baiting people into clicking on his videos because he thinks something is woke and wants to convince other people that it is too.
On this specific point, there is conflicting evidence. You can find news videos about fans' generally positive reactions out of the theater.
It's better than old.
I think the lightsaber battles were the greatest.
It was good, dude. It was really good.
So worth it. So worth it.
They're gonna love it. They're gonna go nuts. It was amazing.
I couldn't get enough of it. I want to see it again already.
And many of the prequels have a high cinema score if you consider that a valid metric. That being said, is this really an issue? Even if the Critical Drinker was wrong, we are talking about the consensus of the films at various points in time. He even goes on to say that the prequels were deeply flawed and people are looking back at them with rose-tinted glasses. Is this it for the Drinker criticism? There is not even anything substantive to really even refute here. Out of all the things, you decided to tackle a video discussing the differences in reception between the prequels and sequels, one which contains very little actual analysis of the films in question. It's almost as if you purposely picked this video, instead of, his actual reviews and character breakdowns of the sequel trilogy going in-depth as to why they would not have resonated with people.
However, something is very interesting about this. Whenever a piece of media that he thinks is spreading quote-unquote the message is actually received well, he will somewhat backpedal and say, oh, this is alright, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was gonna be, while still throwing up random things about how it shouldn't have been woke anyway.
Barbie was an incredibly popular film, grossing over $1 billion at the box office and was reviewed positively by critics and audiences. Drinker did not like the film. He didn't backtrack or change his opinion after the fact.
When Disney initially dropped the first trailer for Prey, which was meant to be a Hulu exclusive, of course Drinker hopped right on top of this, immediately trying to call it woke propaganda and complaining about how a young Native American girl could possibly take on their predator, when even Arnold Schwarzenegger struggled to do so back in the 1980s. He also magically assesses that clearly from this one single trailer, this must be feminist propaganda, and it also isn't accurate to old hunter-gatherer societies because they would have beaten the crap out of somebody like this, is apparently his reasoning.
So of course our protagonist turns out to be a strong female character who just wants to become a hunter against the wishes and traditions of her tribe. Why? So the rest of the plot can happen. Also, I'd like to point out that no hunter-gatherer society of that time period would have tolerated this kind of bullshit from one of their own. Those ideas would have been literally beaten out of her before she could say, smash the patriarchy.
The last point he tries to make take there, when you really think about it, doesn't actually hold that much water, because there have been plenty of movies set in history that aren't technically historically accurate that are still received very well, such as Amadeus being a great example.
I don't believe there's anything wrong with negatively reacting to a trailer, and based off the trailer stating that you don't believe the film will be good. That being said, here I will agree with OtterlyNoah that simply because a film deviates from history does not mean it will be bad. The conversation is certainly more nuanced as to what has changed and for what reason matters. However, there is certainly not a one-size-fits-all answer. But for this context, I will agree with OtterlyNoah.
But what makes this even more foolish is that when Prey actually came out, it was actually received very well, even by some viewers of The Critical Drinker. And after realizing this, he ended up making a half-hearted video about how he thinks Prey was at least okay, which is basically just code for I shouldn't have based this movie just on its trailer.
Where is your evidence for this? You just made this up. Oh, Critical Drinker saw the reaction and then adjusted his opinion, because his opinion on the actual film differs than his opinion about the trailer. I guarantee you, if Critical Drinker said he did not enjoy the film, people would say that he just prejudges his film, decides his opinion beforehand, and doesn't change it. But if Drinker said that the film was decent or surprisingly good, then he's just a grifter who goes with the popular opinion. Even though he didn't do it with Barbie, but let's just ignore that.
And it's also ironic that he tries to use these exact points against Prey when, just a year earlier, he praised Disney's original animated Mulan for the exact same things.
See, the original actually took a pretty balanced and realistic view of the subject of women serving in the military. Animated Mulan wasn't particularly big or strong or good at fighting, because that wouldn't be realistic given her background. She was actually kind of clumsy and unsure of herself, and she had to work extra hard just to keep up with her male counterparts. But the difference here is that Prey is a prequel, you see. A prequel about a young Native American girl who has to defy her tribal traditions in order to take on a nearly invincible hunter from another world. Because, you know, if elite special forces operatives, hard-boiled detectives, and entire squads of specially trained government agents can't stop these things, then a 100-pound teenage girl is definitely going to make the difference.
Drinker literally wants to have his cake and eat it too. He will call a movie like Prey quote-unquote woke, but not a movie like 1988 Mulan, which does the exact same kind of thing with its main female character. Both Mulan and Naru are not Mary Sue characters, and they both lose a lot, actually. And they both really have to work and train to beat the big bad guy that they're facing. Yet while Drinker will criticize Prey for this, he'll praise Mulan for the exact same thing. Like, come on, dude, make it make sense.
Okay, Critical Drinker said that Mulan had a more balanced approach, meaning that even if they tackle similar situations from a very general standpoint, the executions of each could lead to significantly different outcomes. It could be that Mulan joined the army not just to destroy the patriarchy or to prove society wrong. She did it so that her old father would not have to be conscripted, giving a more personal and sympathetic motivation. Additionally, even though both characters have to learn to fight, at the end of the day, Mulan is fighting other men, compared to the literal fucking predator. The power level Mulan would have to close is infinitely more believable than the one Nari would have to. Given that the whole initial scene of the original is to establish how skilled the entire group is, this is possibly the most elite team of soldiers humanity could assemble with decades of combined combat experience armed with military hardware being hunted for sport. Given that fact, it logically stands that Nari should have little to no chance of winning. And although she does trick the predator, she still fights him earlier on and should not have survived that encounter. To be fair, I would argue that this precedent started before Nari. As more and more people end up killing the predator, it becomes less tense and the mystique and aura surrounding the predator diminishes. But this should show that simply comparing one story to another and highlighting their similarities is not hypocrisy, as we see the details of the execution could lead to one very successful example compared to a more mixed one.
At the end of the day, Critical Drinker is a pretty blatant hypocrite and also just a grifter trying to push his own beliefs onto others in the guise of a very negative movie review. And unfortunately, it does look like this has worked in a lot of ways, since there are a lot of people he's convinced that Hollywood is being ruined because it's too quote-unquote woke, when in reality, there's a lot of other more nuanced issues with Hollywood that you could say is ruining it. It doesn't just boil down to a movie being woke or whatever, that's just dumb.
You know what's funny is that Critical Drinker does talk about these things.
But one of the biggest overriding factors in all of this is a financial one. Put simply, movies are too damn expensive these days. The production budgets for mainstream Hollywood films have been steadily rising since the 1990s, but the process has accelerated out of control over the past few years.
But inevitably, Drinker is not the only film critic to constantly try and push this agenda. Enter Nerdrotic, a channel that pretty much does the same thing as Drinker, but like 10 times more aggressive. There's a video he did where he tries to claim that Marvel is failing post-Endgame because they all got woke, quote-unquote. He lists a bunch of examples of failed Marvel projects post-2020, but interestingly enough, one he brings up is both Loki Season 1 and Season 2.
And of the 9 live-action D+ series, only 1 has gotten a second season, and it was awful. We're not going to allow that cope here.
Which is kind of funny, because if you look at that, those are actually 2 of the most highly acclaimed Marvel projects from the last 5 years. And it also just so happens to have a pretty diverse cast. Huh, funny how that is, isn't it?
This is not even a refutation. Nerdrotic made the claim that none of the MCU shows outside of Loki were successful, given that Loki was the only MCU show to receive a second season, which you didn't contest. And then Nerdrotic said that Loki was awful, so as refutation you showed the IMDb score? This is not an argument. Did Nerdrotic say the consensus was that Loki was awful? Or, most likely, it's his belief that the show is awful, which is not really a matter of fact-checking. If in response to my defense of Bourne Legacy you throw up the IMDb score, that's not a refutation either. And I also like the little insinuation that just because he didn't like the show and it happens to be diverse, that's some sort of indication as to an underlying bigotry. Oh, would you look at that? This is a project that Nerdrotic liked that was diverse. Huh, funny how that works.
And what do you know, Nerdrotic has actually straight up admitted to using rage bait for money and views before. Around the time the second Spider-Verse film was coming out, he took this opportunity to try and post Miles Morales is Miles Morales every chance he got, since he knew this would upset Spider-Man fans.
I've made $1,000 on Twitter. $1,000. And I know there's people out there stealing content like Ian Miles Chong making a lot more, but I'm making $1,000 off of Miles Morales tweets. Shit I would do for free. That, for one, is America. That is capitalism. And it's fucking hilarious.
Dude, come on. Is this really something you want to be bragging about?
Yeah, he said he would do this regardless of if he was paid or not.
He'll often try to stir the pot by just saying straight up racist things even.
What there wasn't a lot of was men. Not sure what happened to all the dudes in Wakanda. Maybe they went off to get a pack of Salems and never came back. Oh shit, I don't know if I'll keep that one in.
It's a joke. If you're referencing South Park, I'm sure you can handle this without being triggered. In this section, OtterlyNoah tackles the YouTuber Endymion, covering one of his videos. Here, Endymion criticizes the depiction of April O'Neil from TMNT. The race bending is stupid on its face. However, Endymion goes on to focus on April being fat, his core arguments being that April is a role model to be fit as well as active, and that this depiction erases that part of the character, concluding that just by the character being fat, it's legitimizing an unhealthy lifestyle. As a fan of Tony Soprano, I just couldn't get on board with this criticism. OtterlyNoah goes on to tackle these points, and I would agree with most of what he had to say in this specific section.
He also took the opportunity to get mad at a new incarnation of another 80s cartoon character, that being Snake Eyes from G.I. Joe, and oh boy, he sure had some stuff to say on that.
A really good tone-deaf example of this is the movie Snake Eyes. By making him Asian instead of white, the writers end up missing the whole point of Snake Eyes as a character. By making him Asian, the filmmakers are pushing the stereotype that only Asian people should be able to do martial arts in films, not realizing that Snake Eyes was deliberately made a white man to break the stigma surrounding that stereotype. And with him being white, it was meant to showcase that anyone could learn martial arts, and it broke the tired trope that only Asian people knew how to fight.
Okay, first off, I think if you asked any random person on the street if they knew Snake Eyes was white, I think they'd answer no. And I think that's for 2 very big reasons. One, Snake Eyes always covers up and wears a mask. Nobody knows what he looks like, so most people probably don't even know he's white. And secondly, the way his character is, it doesn't really matter whether he's white or Asian, because the whole appeal of Snake Eyes is the entire mystery surrounding his identity. The only things that really matter with Snake Eyes at the end of the day are his rivalries, the fact he wears all black and never talks, and the fact he conceals his identity. The fact he's nameless and has no real sense of identity is actually a big part of the reason why people like him. He just has a cool design. Whether he's white or Asian really has nothing to do with that.
If the film didn't race bend Snake Eyes and followed the original story, Snake Eyes would be a white American soldier thrust into the Arishikage clan as an outsider. Seeing him acclimatize to different culture and rise through the ranks and ultimately clash with Storm Shadow, where invariably the underlying tension of being a white American compared to Storm Shadow himself as a native of the land and the clan would come into play either explicitly or in the subtext of the film. This would be interesting and would add an extra layer to their relationship, seeing 2 different individuals with different cultural upbringings and philosophies clash with each other, and seeing Storm Shadow be spurned that an outsider eclipsed him. OtterlyNoah's response is to appeal to the lack of knowledge of the general population.
If you asked any random person on the street if they knew Snake Eyes was white, I think they'd answer no.
But you know who would know the character's identity? I don't know, maybe G.I. Joe fans, the people who have read the comics where Snake Eyes is depicted as a white man. Or I know, even better, how about people who watch the G.I. Joe movies? Look at that, you don't even have to be a fan of the entire franchise, you could just watch the films. This argument holds little weight.
1. Snake Eyes always covers up and wears a mask. Nobody knows what he looks like, so most people probably don't even know he's white.
How much of the general population knows what Spawn's alter ego is, given that most of the time the character's wearing either Letha of the 7th House of K or looks like this underneath his masks? The second argument OtterlyNoah makes is that most of the time race does not play a factor for Snake Eyes. But the issue is that there are characters whose race does not really matter compared to other aspects of the character. However, whitewashing these characters would receive pushback from the same people demanding Snake Eyes be Asian. For example, in the show Teen Titans, Cyborg is half human and half robot. For the most part, just like Snake Eyes, his race does not factor into his story. Cyborg's arc is dealing with his half-robot side. While others' limitations are not defined, his are, through his battery levels, his power source, the mechanical limits of stress and strain, all defined by mechanical limits. Recognizing his humanity and pushing past those barriers is what his character in Teen Titans goes through. On that aspect, it would not matter what his race is. In the often cited episode where Starfire is labeled as a Troc, a slur for Starfire's people, this is the one episode where Cyborg's race comes into play, when Starfire asks Cyborg if he knows what it feels like to be judged based off the way you look. And the subtext of Cyborg's race is apparent. However, technically speaking, Cyborg's answer is that he does because he's half robot. Ostensibly, this scene would still work from a plot perspective if Cyborg was white.
You know what it feels like to be judged simply because of how you look?
Of course I do. I'm part robot.
You would not have the subtext in this specific scene, but this is only one episode out of the 5 seasons. Most of the time when watching Cyborg, his race is not a factor. Just like OtterlyNoah stated that most of the times, Snake Eyes' race doesn't matter. Now, I don't actually support whitewashing Cyborg, but according to OtterlyNoah's logic, it could work. This could also apply to other characters like Michael Lane, for example. If you did a live-action adaptation, you could argue that he's behind the mask for most of the time, if not all the time, and his race doesn't matter to the story. The funniest thing, however, is most of OtterlyNoah's arguments are moot, as many of them deal with Snake Eyes being covered up the whole time and being a very blank slate in the G.I. Joe. The issue is that this film is an origin story for Snake Eyes, taking place before his time at G.I. Joe, where he spends a significant amount of time outside of his classic costume, and most importantly, the story takes place before Snake Eyes doesn't say anything and is a blank slate. Here, he very much is a character with his own motivations and personality. The people who justify race bending under these arguments never hold them consistently, because if the argument is flipped, they will come up with some new excuse as to why in their preferred instance it's okay. The core motivation is more diversity for diversity's sake, and whatever rules need to bend or break for it to happen is what will inevitably happen. Maintaining a consistent standard and pushing back against race bending is a reasonable stance to have. The strongest evidence against all of this is that the creator of Snake Eyes later went on to state that he should have made Snake Eyes Asian from the very beginning. In this case, however, it's still reasonable to disagree. At this point, Snake Eyes has been one way for decades. Over time, the character has gained fans and resonated with many. Much like how J.K. Rowling will go back and say, oh yeah, this character was actually a person of color or LGBT all along, people pushing back against that is not a bigoted position. The push to make characters who know martial arts, who are trained in East Asia, Asian is a tired push. It was seen when actor Finn Jones left social media because of an online social media firestorm that insisted Danny Rand should be Asian, even though from his inception the character has been white. The ultimate cherry on top is that this happens in real life. Many MMA fighters will travel to Thailand to learn Muay Thai at its source from all across the world. As for the box office, I myself along with others lost excitement with the news of race-bending Snake Eyes, similarly to how people lost excitement with Scarlett Johansson's casting for Ghost in the Shell, where you could make the argument that given the protagonist is a cyborg and lives in a postmodern international cyberpunk setting, that the race does not really come up in the story at all, as the chief arc in question is what it means to be human. I'm not saying the chief reason Snake Eyes bombed was race-bending Snake Eyes, but some fans were definitely disappointed by the decision and may have skipped the film in theaters.
Immediately after this, he tries to deny any allegations of racism that could be thrown at him for what he just said about two different characters by talking about how he loves Spawn.
Spawn had a stranglehold on a young me from the moment I saw him. He looked insanely badass, and his outfit was scary with those glowing green eyes and the flowing red cape and chains that shot out of his body like Spider-Man's webs. As a child all the way to even now, I still love Spawn and always went out of my way to consume any media that had him in it. Spawn was also a black superhero whose real name is Al Simmons. I'm Serbian and Armenian, so I'm like a white person mixed with the Kardashians basically. By modern creator views, I shouldn't be able to see myself or connect with Spawn because he and I are different skin colors from different backgrounds.
Okay, so two things. First of all, he doesn't really describe what specifically about Spawn's character he relates to. He pretty much just says Spawn looked cool and that's why I liked him. He doesn't go anything beyond the actual design of the character.
In this next section, I both agree with OtterlyNoah and Endymion. In the original video, it seems that Endymion seems to mix up a character that one would find relatable versus a character that he would find cool, as he doesn't articulate why he found Spawn personally relatable. He articulates how he gravitated to Spawn as an engaging character. However, Endymion is still fundamentally correct here. You don't need to physically look like the character to find them engaging or personally relatable. The increasing emphasis that identities need to match, whether it be between the protagonist and the writer, the protagonist and the director, or finally the protagonist and the reviewer, is a corrosive force on media discourse. This section of the video is a much better illustration of Endymion's point, where he goes on to analyze the African American and Latino community's love for Naruto and Dragon Ball Z, given how much affection there is from these communities that look nothing like the character, proving that characters can be relatable even if they do not look like certain audience members, a notion that I would agree with.
Then he also goes ahead and says by modern creator reviews he shouldn't be able to see himself in Spawn because they are different skin color, come from different backgrounds. That in of itself is segregating. He literally just said you don't have to look like a character to relate to them, but then goes ahead and says by all means I shouldn't be able to relate to this character. He just defeated his own point. Also, I'm not really sure what this Spawn thing has to do with anything, given he was just talking about how he hates April and also hates Snake Eyes apparently. It doesn't really feel like any of this was really that well thought out.
My guy, how do you not understand what Endymion's argument is? It's laid out plainly. Endymion is arguing against those who force diversity and representation in all contexts. People who do this utilize arguments stating that having characters that look like the viewer is one of the most important aspects for relatability, as this is the chief way most audiences relate to the characters in their paradigm. Thus, the insistence to force diversity in any manner, even if it makes little sense in the story or goes against source material. This is how a race-bent April and Snake Eyes enter the discussion. Thus, Endymion's rebuttal is to discuss various characters and how they deeply relate to individuals who don't share the identity of the character. I mean, it's literally the title of the video itself. How is this hard to follow at all?
Which, at the end of the day, most of these anti-woke grifter channels come off like this anyway. Most of them try to take the tiniest thing and make a big deal out of it to make it seem like diversity is ruining Hollywood. Their motto is go woke, go broke, and to them that means if a film has a diverse cast, then it's gonna flop.
But that's not what they say. Typically, the anger against diversity is when it makes no sense. It is often the inclusion of diversity when it doesn't fit with the story being told, often ignoring source material, lore, or history. Pushing back against forced diversity in this sense is fine.
At the end of the day, whether a film is diverse or not does not determine whether it's gonna be a flop or not. It's the film itself. In order to properly criticize a film, you have to look at the fundamentals of what makes a film a film. You have to look at storytelling, cinematography, acting, pacing, dialogue, all these things that are fundamental aspects of a film. You can't just take a superficial look at something and call it woke and call it a day. That's not real criticism.
These critics do like diverse things. However, if you hone in on the parts where they take issue with race-bending a character, say they feel that way about all characters of color, and then go on to ignore the sections where they do talk about the things you just stated, well, then it's fairly easy to paint the narrative you want.
Just recently, the highly acclaimed Star Wars television series Andor just ended its second season. This second season was highly anticipated by fans since the original season actually aired all the way back in 2022 on Disney+. It seems this second season was worth the wait, however, since it's been highly acclaimed and the show overall has been praised for how it takes a more grounded, realistic look at the universe of Star Wars. But unfortunately, a certain notorious subset of reviewers on YouTube weren't so happy about this second season. I'm talking about none other than anti-woke television critics who are very, very not happy with Andor, believe it or not. Oh boy.
Now, this could be an editing mistake. OtterlyNoah is flashing up images of YouTubers who enjoyed the show while stating they didn't, which would be another blatant lie. There is a possibility that he got lazy and decided to just throw up a smattering of broadly anti-woke critics for the visual. However, if this is the case, it's lazy and irresponsible, or he's just lying again. That's also a possibility.
It was just off-putting. I feel like what George did was that he had implied scenes. So like Anakin with the kids, with the lightsabers, and then it cuts. You know what's going to happen. And there was actually supposed to be a scene where you show all of the kids chopped up on the floor, but they decided against it. And I've covered that as well in videos. Also, even Nick Gillard told me that there was a scene where, the hologram scene, that was an actual scene that they ended up taking and turning it into a hologram because it was too dark. That was a full-on scene, right? Where Anakin was choking out one person, like killing another, and then beheading, and then fighting Syndra. Like, that was all filmed.
So already, Star Wars Theory does admit that Star Wars has tackled darker things before, and even in some cases, they've straight up filmed things like mutilation. And even like he stated here, in a movie like Revenge of the Sith, Anakin is shown getting ready to mutilate hundreds of Jedi younglings. And he's also later shown choking his own wife to death. And heck, he's even tortured his own daughter with a torture droid before.
Did you notice something? However disagreeable I find this take by Star Wars Theory, he never stated that it was woke. All the clips you played of him are where he states that he found the scene uncomfortable and distasteful, not that it was woke. Now, maybe somewhere else in a buried tweet or another video, Star Wars Theory does state that it's woke. But that's not what OtterlyNoah used as evidence. At this point, any criticism from people he doesn't like is just people complaining about wokeness, even when it's literally not.
The argument a lot of people are making is that it's a real show, it's for adults, and I'm like, do you need to see that for it to be a real show? You need to see that for it to be an adult show. Listen, we all have experiences with, unfortunately, SA. I don't want to see it in my Star Wars. Look, Sopranos is my favorite show in the entire world. There's a very real scene with that in there. It fits the show. It fits that world. It fits that real world on Earth. This never been done in Star Wars, doesn't need to be there. There's a lot of people that have a problem with it. I have a problem with it. I don't need to see that.
But the thing is, that scene also fits Andor just as much as it fits The Sopranos. As stated before, Andor is a much more realistic, hardened look at what the Empire does when it's in control of an entire galaxy. It's a really introspective look at what life under a fascist regime looks like. And the truth is, in a fascist regime, stuff like this would probably go unchecked and happen a lot. Especially by those in power and in command in a scenario like this. So really, no matter what Star Wars Theory tries to say here, it actually does fit the world of Andor really well.
I don't agree with the criticism that this scene was misplaced. In fact, you know who else disagreed? The very anti-woke critics you have been flashing up in the first place.
It doesn't actually happen, and she does kill him.
Yeah, but even it being implied to the point where, he's like got her from behind and being aggressive and hitting her, I didn't feel like it belonged in Star Wars.
I think it paints a perfect picture of the Empire, though, and I'm going to give my 2 cents here, and then I'll shut up about this whole thing, but I think it reflects really well in painting a picture of the true horrors of the Empire, because if we're going to sit here and paint pictures of the bureaucracy of essentially space, fascism, right, and we're going to go through all these people and their terrible mission and all that stuff, it makes perfect sense to me that you would have Imperials that are essentially working almost unchecked, because somebody like Palpatine and Vader is not directly overseeing what Joe Schmo is doing on this planet to these people, right? So it makes sense to me that it happens. If we're talking about making an adult show that is for adults about Star Wars, it has a Star Wars label on it, but it's meant for an adult audience, that is something that happens. People that are power hungry and cruel commit acts like murdering children, like blowing up planets, and therefore forcing themselves on women that they see as basically inhuman is not out of the question.
Like I said, if this was like a Game of Thrones level type of scene, I could understand why there's some like backlash and outrage, but to me, it wasn't even, it was kind of like a big nothing burger.
Yeah.
Because we saw an Imperial officer attempting to force himself on someone, and he got killed for it.
Yet OtterlyNoah was perfectly okay with making vast generalizations about the entire group. Again, I do agree with OtterlyNoah that this scene was fine, and getting upset at the events when just as worse, if not worse things have occurred in Star Wars doesn't make sense. but you can find people like the Critical Drinker or Snarky J who enjoyed Andor.
Nerdrotic also made a video about this, so let's see what he had to say.
There was an attempted rape scene in Star Wars.
He turns around to face Bix with a sympathetic look.
My shoulders get sore. He must have strong hands.
Honestly, I think that scene is much ado about nothing considering the controversy is overshadowing stuff that is far worse, including the heavy-handed immigration allegory, because we haven't seen that genre in the last 6 days, Mon Mothma dancing to 90s techno music, or Andor escaping the squabbling rebels who imprisoned him while they were distracted playing a game of rock, paper, scissors.
I find it funny that he tries to act like immigration allegories and real-world political events overall being integrated into Star Wars is a totally new thing, clearly. That only happened in the last 6 days. When, in actuality, as stated before, that's always been a part of Star Wars. This franchise really always has had a political influence, even from the very beginning.
I also agree with OtterlyNoah that the allegory makes sense within the context of the story. But outside of a few personalities, most people who watched Andor enjoyed it, including some anti-woke critics.
They've also recently taken shots at Avatar: The Last Airbender, the popular Nickelodeon cartoon, which is currently undergoing a series of revivals. One such revival is actually a movie called The Legend of Aang: The Last Airbender, which is set to come out in theaters in 2026 and serve as a sequel to the original series. But you know who's not excited for this film? None other than Rev Says Desu, who made a whole video saying that this movie is woke. Apparently he's very upset that this film is not bringing back the cast of the original cartoon, so let's see what he had to say on that.
But if you scroll down here, you also notice she has some upcoming projects like The Legend of Aang, The Last Airbender, and that is something that is mired in some controversy because that is supposed to be a part of 3 films that are basically continuing on where the series left off, and I think it's focusing more on their adulthood adventures, and there's something odd about it. The entire original cast is gone in terms of the voice actors, and that's a mistake and makes people kind of scratch their heads because they had very iconic performances that a lot of people really cherish when they look back at them.
So the thing about that is that this film is actually supposed to feature Team Avatar in their early to mid-20s, and Aang is actually supposed to be 25 in this film. So I really don't think it would make sense to cast the same voice actor that did the kid version of Aang in the original show for this movie. It's supposed to be an older take on the character, so I honestly think it makes more sense to cast a voice actor who's gonna be able to do an older version of Aang for this movie.
This casting director would respond, saying this: I told Mike and Brian that I understood how important it was to get this right for them and for the fans because I'm a fan too, also my favorite IP. Since the original show was released, there's been more emphasis in voiceover to match actors' ethnic/racial background to the characters they're portraying. ATLA is a fictional world, but there are cultural influences for each nation/kingdom, and we wanted to explore the talent from those groups. It's about providing a good voice for a character, and all of this nonsense about having to understand the background of these characters in order to give a proper performance is totally ridiculous. It's one of those things, it's meant to be so progressive and yet it is so regressive, and all it does is segregate people based on the color of their skin and limit their opportunities based on the color of their skin. It's ridiculous.
I had to rewrite and re-record this section because I did not realize how misleading this motherfucker is. Sure, based on how OtterlyNoah presents Rev's arguments and the casting situation in general, it seems reasonable. Given that the characters have aged, the voice actors who played these characters originally as kids may not be best for the role now. It could be that other voice actors could better inhabit the characters in their older versions in this new film. Thus, why the original cast is not assembled for this new movie. The issue is that this is not at all the reason that was given from the casting director in charge of the new movie.
Where you see this Ask Me Anything being hosted by this casting director named Jenny Jue. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but she is someone who, if you look at her resume, she's very accomplished as a casting director. She did films like Snowpiercer, Inglourious Bastards, Avatar: The Last Airbender Season 2, but if you scroll down here, you also notice she has some upcoming projects like The Legend of Aang, The Last Airbender, and that is something that is mired in some controversy, and that was something asked in the Ask Me Anything, where this person said, is there any reason why you guys decided not to bring the original cast back for the ultimate nostalgia trip? The characters' voices are just so iconic and distinct, I find it hard to really accept anyone else in their roles, plus promoting the movie with the original actors coming back would break the internet and truly feel like the original show is back. And I agree 100% with some of these claims that are being made here, but this casting director would respond, saying this: I told Mike and Brian that I understood how important it was to get this right for them and for the fans because I'm a fan too, also my favorite IP. Since the original show was released, there's been more emphasis in voiceover to match actors' ethnic/racial background to the characters they're portraying. ATLA is a fictional world, but there are cultural influences for each nation/kingdom, and we wanted to explore the talent from those groups.
The reason the casting director gave was that many of the original voice actors did not match the ethnicity of the characters they were playing. This is why they were not brought back as stated explicitly by the casting director. Because of new industry standards and trends that demanded more quote-unquote authentic casting. Meaning that today's standards of casting voice actors would prohibit many of the voice actors from playing the characters if The Last Airbender was made today. Ridiculous. Thus, why Rev says that the casting director is woke and the trend in the industry is a negative one.
Imagine the anime dub industry if this was actually practiced. Pretty much everyone would be out of a job. Unless you were a Japanese-born English voice actor, you wouldn't be able to play pretty much any of the roles. Imagine if you were a black voice actor in the anime industry. All of your opportunities would just evaporate. Maybe 1 out of every 1,000 characters would be something you could have a chance at voice acting, the ones you'd be allowed to voice act, by people like ProZD. And of course, you think about some of the other iconic performances where someone's ethnicity or their gender didn't match the character they played. We would have lost these performances if it was going the way that people like ProZD and this casting director want things to go. These people would not have had these opportunities, and you wouldn't have legendary voices like from Samurai Jack. It'd be such a shame if we actually listened to these maniacs who are trying very hard to push this thing. And it's, again, an absolute shame. It's something we have talked about before with ProZD. You might recognize him from his popular YouTube channel. He's also a voice actor, and pretty much from the jump in his voice acting career, as we talked about in previous videos, was trying to propagate this idea of authentic casting. And that's what we're talking about with this current situation, where he is espouting this belief that you have to match the ethnicity of the character you are playing, which is so unbelievably ridiculous.
Okay, I just find this really funny here. Rev says Desu tries to claim that ProZD is in favor of segregated voice acting, and that he thinks when it comes to voice acting race-based characters, only voice actors with that character's ethnicity should be playing that character. But the thing is, even if you just take a cursory glance at the article that Rev is showing here, it literally says voice actor Sungwon ProZD Cho criticizes race-based casting. You don't even have to barely look to see that ProZD isn't in favor of this at all. And his career as a voice actor kinda shows this too. He's played plenty of characters who don't just reflect his ethnicity, like Sunder from Boyfriend Dungeon or Radiskor from God of War Ragnarok, a little Nordic squirrel. If anything, ProZD has actually been a huge proponent of being able to have a versatile repertoire of voices you can do. So really, everything Rev has said here is just straight up misinformation. ProZD doesn't really think this at all, nor is he saying that at all here.
Think about it in a logical way here.
No, I think this is just him criticizing race-based casting and voice acting like he was talking about in that article that you lied about already. Rev seems so intent on trying to make ProZD look like someone who's in favor of race-based casting when really all the evidence points in the opposite direction of that. All it really takes is a simple Google search or looking through his Twitter feed to show that he really doesn't think that at all. If someone doesn't actually bother to fact-check something like this though, they might actually end up believing what Rev says here, as ridiculous as it is. Generally though, that's the goal of most grifters on YouTube and other channels. They'll usually try to imbue their own beliefs onto their audience in the form of a negative criticism or review of something. And generally their hope is that you won't fact check them at all so they can actually convince you of these kinds of things. But this is just blatantly spreading misinformation. There's no real criticism going on here whatsoever.
To condense this section, and for the sake of brevity, I will summarize Drinker's main complaints, Noah's response, and my rebuttal.
Don't waste my motherfucking time!
Critical Drinker complains that the Loki you see in the show is a worse, toned-down, pussified version of the God of Mischief. This hurts the show, along with introducing a superior female version of the character contributing to its low quality. OtterlyNoah's response is to state that the Loki from the show is actually the same Loki you see post-Avengers. Noah further states that Loki and Sylvie work well together and the show is not putting her above him due to some of the fights that Loki and Sylvie have together, where they perform equally. The issue with Noah's response is it's blatantly untrue. This is not the same Loki post-Avengers. The show very quickly introduces a scene with the sole purpose to fundamentally change the character of Loki. The scene where he watches all of his paths end in failure is shown to justify the significant change his character makes. Loki is not trying to actively work against or backstab individuals in the TVA who are his friends throughout the show. He actually starts a genuine friendship with Mobius. The scene is so explicit in its nature and purpose, I have no idea how OtterlyNoah failed to consider it. If you don't want to take my word for it, you can take the showrunners.
For Loki to see how his life and death plays out, we We talked about how in Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear finally learns and comes to grips with the fact that he is, in fact, a toy when he sees the commercial, and just what a humbling experience that is, explained Waldron in an interview with IGN. And that's the thing that can finally take the bluster out of Loki, realizing, wow, I was never actually in control the way that I thought I was. That's why we wanted Loki to see that, and I think we also knew it would be really emotional and impactful, and Tom Hiddleston would do a great job with it.
As for the action, for the most part Loki just sucks at fighting the TVA, while Sylvie is very good. He glazes her multiple times for this very fact. For OtterlyNoah to get such things wrong about a show and still cite media literacy is hilarious. As an addendum, this discussion only pertains to Season 1 of Loki.
And more recently, they've gone after Ironheart, the most recent Disney Plus Marvel show. For me personally, I think there are a lot of very valid criticisms you can throw at a show like Ironheart. Probably one of the biggest ones is that I don't think most people even remember Riri Williams' character from Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Like, she showed up for a brief moment there, and then it seemed like she was kinda just forgotten about until this show came out. They didn't really try to build her character up at all or make people excited or anticipate this show whatsoever. But of course, that's not the thing these guys are mad about. They're just mad that a black female character is taking center stage in a Marvel show.
That's not really a criticism of anything that goes on in the show. You criticize the MCU's weakness in establishing Riri Williams before her show, but you didn't discuss anything or any elements within the show itself. This is a pattern throughout OtterlyNoah's videos, that his criticism is oftentimes far more weak than anyone else he's criticizing for having bad criticism.
Let's take a look at a review for the show from one of the anti-woke grifters, that being Heel vs. Babyface. You know, the 50-year-old man who threw a temper tantrum for about 2 minutes because he didn't like that there were pronouns in Starfield? Yeah, that guy. I bet he has a lot of very insightful commentary for this show, so let's take a look.
So it starts off with a soliloquy from Riri, which in my world means something I think completely different to what they think it means. And she talks about how she believes she can be the greatest inventor of her generation. Probably not that difficult, let's be honest. But something's holding her back. She's had all the help from Wakanda, she's had the Stark internship or whatever.
So the thing is, Riri actually never had a Stark internship, even though Heel tries to claim that here. In the show, she mentions having an internship abroad, which is actually just referring to what she did in Black Panther Wakanda Forever. There's nothing at all about her in the MCU interning at Stark Industries, so I'm not really sure what Heel was talking about here.
No, you do know what he's talking about, you're just intentionally being obtuse. Riri has a Stark fellowship, as says an internship or whatever, leaving open the possibility that it was something different than he recalled. The fellowship is still a massive advantage and opportunity, so I don't know why you pretend that he has no idea what he's talking about. Why lie like this?
But she doesn't have the cash dollar money, because the only reason that Tony Stark got to where he was because he was a billionaire. Yeah, I don't think the person that made this watched Iron Man.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps!
And I don't think you paid attention to that scene at all, Heel, because that's actually not what happens here. In this scene, Riri is discussing how she needs funds to pull off the ideas and inventions that she wants. She mentions that because Tony Stark was a billionaire who inherited his fortune from his father, he was able to make the inventions that he wanted to. She's not trying to say at all that Tony Stark doesn't do work just because he's a billionaire. He still made all his own inventions. And him being a billionaire just happened to aid him with that, so she wants money to be able to do the same thing. That's really all there is here, and it's pretty easy to see, but it looks like Heel missed that. Or probably the more likely answer, he knew this was the case, but he wanted to try and mislead his audience.
No, that's not true.
Do you think Tony Stark would be Tony Stark if he wasn't a billionaire? No shade. That's just the way the world works.
Riri Williams said that Tony Stark would not be Tony Stark if he was not a billionaire, essentially meaning that without the resources of a billionaire, he would not be who he is. The issue is that this very sentiment is in direct conflict with what we see of the character, where in various situations, devoid of the resources of a billionaire, he is still able to find inventive solutions to problems, making him who he is. It's not actually about the suit of armor. There's an entire film and dialogue dedicated to this. You could maybe argue that Riri Williams would not know this. However, Tony Stark is one of the most, if not the most outward public-facing Avenger, almost to his detriment, so there is no excuse. There is even a documentary about his life within the MCU. Listen, if Riri Williams is supposed to be an unlikable character, that's fine, but then don't be upset when nobody likes her. which was probably not the showrunner and writer's intent.
I also find it funny that literally every single anti-woke grifter that has talked about this show always uses that clip of Obadiah Stane from the first Iron Man movie. It's like these guys always play a giant game of telephone whenever making these videos and figure out what clips they do and don't want to use when making these videos, since they want to figure out what will help them best project this message to their audience.
As for everyone using the same clip, it's most likely because of how famous it was originally and how effective of a refutation it is of Riri's statements in a relatively short time frame. Like how almost everybody going after the drinker will use the same talking point about Glass Onion, which we'll get to later. Did you guys all hang out in the same Discord or something?
She does what all good heroes do, immediately turns to crime. I'm kind of confused because if we're the people that always get called racist, etc., why do all the black writers and showrunners immediately turn their black characters into thieves?
Really? So are you gonna sit there and tell me that Black Panther is a thief? A black character that was written by a black writer, Ryan Coogler? Or are you gonna tell me that Adonis from Creed is a thief? Or are you gonna tell me that Sammy from the movie Sinners, which just came out this year, is a thief? Yeah, I didn't think so. Clearly not all black characters written by black writers are written to be criminals. That just doesn't make any sense.
Here, I will agree with OtterlyNoah that this was a poor generalization. Not all black writers write their characters to be criminals, but it's still beyond stupid that Riri turned to crime almost as a first resort because the idea of getting a job was so catastrophic.
Riri then tragically, falls to the ground and dies, splattered to death on the boulevards of Chicago after hitting that concrete at what I can only imagine was over 100 miles an hour. Oh no, she's absolutely fine, because it doesn't matter if you're Thor or Captain America, where you can actually take a hit like this. If you're a 4'11", 90-pound tiny woman with barely any armor on whatsoever, and you smack into that concrete at 100+ miles an hour, you'll be fine.
Oh, right, because in a universe where Kate Bishop falls off a very tall building and survives, in a universe where Star-Lord gets sent into space and somehow survives that, and somehow in a universe where Black Widow manages to walk off everything in her own movie, Riri Williams falling out of the sky and surviving is clearly the most unrealistic thing ever. Also, need to remind you, this is the same series where a giant alien raisin wiped out half of all existence. I don't think realism is really a thing to pick out here, heel.
I find it ironic that the people who often cite media literacy will turn around and make the dumbest arguments. Like, oh, it's all made up, why do you care? Or, are you asking for realism in a superhero story? In this case, we are talking about immersion. Different characters have different powers, abilities, and durability. Whereas Thor could tank a star, other characters like Hawkeye would not be able to. And the argument that a purple man collected rock candy to incinerate half of the universe is not an argument. Immersion is a factor that makes the stories compelling. As is pointing out that Riri falling on concrete at high speeds with a mechanically compromised suit and walking away with no injuries breaks immersion. Your argument of stating that there's other unrealistic things in the MCU is not valid. Even in the Black Widow scenario, I would still take issue with some of the injuries she walks off, and the story's weak attempt to explain it away with Advil was not nearly enough. When Rhodey took a horrific crash, the film didn't just say, oh, he walked it off. He actually suffered legitimate injuries because of it.
So really, the fact that Riri is a black woman is not the thing that makes the comics or this show mediocre. Just like anything else, it is 100% the writing behind this character, because Marvel has totally made good black characters before, Miles Morales being a great example. You can't just look at a show, see a black character, and call that woke propaganda. That's not real criticism. You have to look at the things that make up that character and how they're written and how the quality of the story is overall. How well are the characters fleshed out? How well does the story pace itself? Things like that are really the things that will make or break a show, not the fact that it might have a black character at the center.
But these critics do talk about writing. When they go through the plot and analyze what Riri Williams does and doesn't do and her motivations for doing so, that's criticizing the writing. When the show specifically has undercurrents of Riri Williams' socioeconomic status and race to justify her actions, it will most likely be discussed in the reviews.
Overall, anti-woke television criticism really isn't criticism whatsoever. Rather than looking at all the things you should look for when criticizing a TV show like I just described here, they'd rather get mad that there's a female version of Loki in the latest Loki show, or that Iron Man has supposedly been replaced by a black woman. It's incredibly superficial and honestly lacks a lot of media literacy overall. It's channels like these that discourage media literacy in favor of bashing a minority.
The reason Riri Williams is hated is because of her motivation, her attitude, and most importantly her actions. That is what the majority of criticism is about. In Nerdrotic's review, Critical Drinker's review, almost anybody's review. Any mention of race is coincided with the fact that the show itself brings up race at multiple points in the plot and subtext, so it's not outside of the boundaries of reasonable discussion.
Anti-woke game critics have unfortunately become a very vocal part of game criticism in recent years, despite not really offering any game criticism overall. To them, Ghost of Tsushima having a female main character will automatically make the game bad. Yeah, because that's totally how that works. It's not like there are tons of factors behind the development of every game that could contribute to it being either good or bad. One particular reviewer who has expressed his disdain for Ghost of Yotei is ND-Mayon. ND-Mayon is one of the more notorious anti-woke drifter channels. Naturally, he had a lot to say about Ghost of Yotei, so let's take a look at just what ND-Mayon had to say. Oh boy.
I got a ton of backlash from my comments on Yotei, but I still stand by them that modern games are deliberately replacing almost all franchises with female characters over male ones, and when you point this out, you're then gaslighted into believing that you're a liar when you're just noticing patterns.
Okay, so right off the bat, the examples he gives for franchises that are supposedly replacing male characters with female ones are Ratchet & Clank, The Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, and Uncharted. Even with the first one he picks, he neglects to mention that in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, you play as both Ratchet and Rivet throughout the entirety of the game. Their levels are totally balanced out since you're swapping between dimensions playing as the two of them, so Rivet doesn't replace Ratchet at all. This is just straight up misinformation. Anyone who's actually played Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart can easily tell you this is false. As for The Last of Us, it's the exact same thing. Ellie and Joel are the two main characters in The Last of Us. They share the exact same amount of screen time because the game is trying to evoke a daddy-daughter type feel from it. And with The Last of Us Part 2, even though Joel is killed off early in that game, he's actually still a big part of it, since the fact that Ellie didn't get to fully make up with him is the sole motivator for her to go after Abby and try to seek revenge. So no, it does not boil down to Joel randomly being replaced by a female in that game. And as for Uncharted, the game that ND-Mayon is referring to here is The Lost Legacy, which is a game that actually takes place after Uncharted 4 as a standalone spin-off. It's not even a main Uncharted game. Every other mainline Uncharted game still stars Nathan Drake, so I'm not really sure what he's complaining about here. And with Ghost of Tsushima supposedly being an example of a franchise with a woman protagonist replacing a male one, that is the most boggling of all to me. For one thing, Ghost of Tsushima is barely even an established franchise. It is easily the youngest game series here, having only started in 2020. And really, it's only got 2 games under its belt, one of which hasn't even come out yet. So trying to claim that Ghost of Tsushima is an established franchise with a male hero who's now suddenly being overtaken by a female counterpart really doesn't make any sense when you think about it. After this, he brings up the fact that he thinks Ghost of Tsushima 2 was rebranded to be Ghost of Yotei to match some sort of woke agenda that's going on at Sucker Punch.
In the beginning, I will agree with OtterlyNoah. Even if many of the leads of Sony's IP are women, it's important to view each project separately. And, for the most part, the women protagonists seem to make sense in the narrative they are placed in. I've seen no evidence that higher-ups at Sony have demanded this to be the case. It seems that each developer reached this decision independently, and even in cases where it's fairly unrealistic to have women lead, it's important to keep in mind that many stories focus on the exceptions to the rule. The one scenario out of a million. This is where the agreement ends.
They'd rather hone in on one specific subsidiary of PlayStation that they think is ruining all of their games. I'm talking about none other than Sweet Baby Inc., which is the bane of every anti-woke drifter channel's existence. For those unaware, Sweet Baby Inc. is a pretty standard narrative consultation group that works with a lot of different video game companies overall. It's sort of akin to sensitivity reading. They'll look over a script and say, you might want to change X in your script because of Y. Simple things like that. They've actually worked with companies on many different games in the past, such as God of War Ragnarok, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, and plenty of others.
Really, Sweet Baby Inc. is a standard narrative consulting group. At this point, OtterlyNoah has completely whitewashed the company. There is a reason that he plays 0 clips or shows 0 statements made from employees and former employees of Sweet Baby Inc. Because if he did, people would see just how unhinged this group is. In theory, there is nothing wrong with a narrative consulting group. However, when this group is brought in and can influence the story of games and franchises that people care about, said group can be evaluated much like any other business. And when people discovered many of the personalities behind Sweet Baby Inc., many concluded that the individuals in question should not have any input on a game's narrative given their unhinged statements and the highly ideological and hyper-political nature of the company. Kim Belair, the CEO of Sweet Baby Inc., has made public statements about how she utilizes threats from social justice mobs to solicit clients. I wonder why people would not want someone like this working on video games.
If you're a creative working in AAA, which I did for many, many years, put this stuff up to your higher-ups. And if they don't see the value in what you're asking for when you ask for consultants, when you ask for research, go have a coffee with your marketing team and just terrify them with the possibility of what's going to happen if they don't give you what you want. Because they have to consider, like, I say that a lot as a joke, but it's actually very, very true because...
Statements made by several other members and former members of Sweet Baby Inc. have also come to light. None of them are reasonable. In fact, nearly all of them are hyper-political, unhinged statements regarding various narratives and the gaming industry in general. In a video uploaded 2 years ago, Cameron Wild, an employee of Sweet Baby Inc., gave a presentation at the Game Devs of Color Expo. Her priority throughout this presentation was on inclusion and creating stories where quote-unquote whiteness does not have to live.
Which makes this really hard often. But recently I've started realizing that discomfort, or the place where whiteness doesn't have to live, is where some of the best stories are told. Because in my work, I meet a lot of Tarantinos. These are people who say, I want this to be gritty, dark, or edgy. And they have this obsession with edginess. Sort of a context-free version of art is supposed to make people uncomfortable. As an auteur, Quentin Tarantino feels like someone who grasps after edginess when they don't really have any human tragedy to explore the depths of. They don't understand that growth comes from trauma, sure, but it also comes from joy. He holds a no pain, no gain kind of mentality that I think is unshakably rooted in white supremacist patriarchal values.
Already from her initial approach, we see the direction and the lens through which she sees storytelling, primarily through intersectional identity rather than ensuring quality. Would you want someone writing your game to focus on making the story the best it can be, or someone who wants to make the stories where whiteness doesn't live, or whatever? You probably are picking up on the fact that only a very specific type of story told through a very specific perspective is something she considers to be of quality.
That Brooks worked with Black writers to make sure the jokes came at the expense of whiteness and chipped away at an absurd social hierarchy. It's deliberately and unexpectedly maybe a narrative that contributes to the liberation of people like me. It isn't respectful, it's offensive, yeah, but it offends the right people, which is to me the point of truly incisive, intentional genre work.
Later on, she praises Blazing Saddles as her favorite film. A point in its favor is that it often offends the right people. But I wonder, would she say the same things about stories that offend her? Would it be that she just didn't enjoy the film, or would she take a moral stance against the film? Keep this in mind.
Because ultimately, if you're telling a story that misses its audience, that doesn't ring true, or that fails to cut in the right direction, the problem isn't that it's just insensitive. The problem is it's bad. Like a film called Django Unchained. And I'm sure many people, Quentin Tarantino in particular, feel like it's a liberatory masterwork. But when I sat down to rewatch it, I realized how boring it is. And not only boring, but it's a perfect example of what not to do with genre. Genre is incompatible with the death of the author. In Tarantino's case, the man seems to thrive on people hating him, and so I don't hate him. But I do think his work needs to be critiqued out of existence. In Django Unchained, it's clear in many ways that we're not meant to identify with Django, but to watch him. The point of view character feels as though it's Schultz. We see this in Schultz getting the best lines, the most direct and meaningful confrontations with the main villain, the best, coolest, and most meaningful death, and also the moral high ground. Because whereas Django comes to his rebellion due to his own personal suffering, Schultz gets to pontificate about right and wrong as a means to prove that he's an evolved man. And it results in a movie called Django Unchained, where the titular character never actually feels unleashed. He never goes off the chain. Django claims to be a Western and a blaxploitation film, but doesn't really succeed at either. Django fails to fulfill the role of a hero, or even a tortured hero, like the ones well established, like Clint Eastwood. And Django is never fully allowed to revel in his own capacity for violence the way that you would expect of a blaxploitation film. Yeah, he blows some people away, but only after he's given permission by Schultz's heroic act. At the end of the film, we don't get either a commentary on the simplistic morality of Westerns and blaxploitation, or a satisfying rendering of justice. Yes, Django finds his wife, and she rides silently, I might add, by his side off into the night, but what he needed was to find his people. And at every turn, instead, he left them in despair to fend for themselves, or shot them, or had them killed while he watched. And so it nails the exploitation, providing graphic imagery, brutal violence, and gore, but it fails to be about blackness or about slavery because it wants to point at the wrong thing, which is to say nothing of the hatred he shows for his own people the moment that he gains power over them. A hatred that is obviously rooted in white supremacy. Arguably, this movie should never have existed, because the truth is some stories are not yours to tell. Unless you're willing to step out of the limelight as a white person, you aren't equipped to tell a story about a Black experience.
Man, I really wonder why people would object to this person and like-minded individuals having an input on narratives that they care about or would spend money on. I can't find a single objectionable thing. Sarcasm aside, this is genuinely a baffling take. Django Unchained is a great western. It's bold, written and paced well, has explosive action, phenomenal performances, a satisfying arc and ending. Every single objection that this individual has is explained in the narrative. Django starts off as a slave. The reason why someone like Schultz has the best lines and monologues is most likely due to his formal education. And before Django can do this, he has to learn how to read. Before he can make executive decisions on how to tackle a mission, he probably needs to learn how to be a bounty hunter. Candyland is heavily fortified by armed personnel. You can't just shoot your way through there. In fact, when Schultz makes the impromptu decision to kick things off, it ends badly for both of them. Thus, the entire ruse to get Django's wife back without being put in a compromised situation, which is why Django would defer to Schultz on how to conduct such an operation, which is also why Django has to be despicable to the other slaves at Candyland, something acknowledged by him.
You want me to play a black slaver? Ain't nothing lower than a black slaver. A black slaver is lower than the head house nigga. And buddy, that's pretty fucking low.
Then play him that way. Give me your black slaver.
Even in the end, where she criticizes the film's depiction of his wife being silent, Django doesn't say much either. He just smokes his cigarette and smiles. What type of analysis is this? It's ridiculous. Even as she constantly references how the film Blazing Saddles does genre correctly through the prism of identity, she then has to admit that it fails in its depiction of Native Americans.
But the fact is, while Blazing Saddles is a triumph for me, it is an abject failure at portraying its indigenous characters. And it fails because Brooks made sure to interrogate his bias and privilege in relation to Blackness, but he didn't offer the same respect or care to the only people who can, in my opinion, truly transform Westerns as a genre.
Meaning, the very film she's propping up would be condemned by another community using her own style of analysis. So why even prop this film up at all if it fails the very standards you are advocating for? Another former employee of Sweet Baby Inc. came out and said that for her game Validate, it was important to not have any white people on the team, as white people would just microaggress on everybody at the company, and I guess that would just be one giant HR nightmare.
But who is your team? Validate has a team of mostly all people of color. We have no white people on our team. I did that because I wanted to create a safe environment. And I know the best way for an environment to be safe is to be around people who are just like me. And I'm not saying that white people in the industry are creating unsafe environments. I'm not saying that. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying that sometimes it is hard to work with white people because they think that something made it okay, but it was really a microaggression. And no one wants to deal with that while you're trying to make a game that they love.
Man, I wonder why someone would object to Sweet Baby Inc. To any reasonable person, this alone would disqualify such a group from having input on various narratives. Now, maybe OtterlyNoah agrees. Maybe he does think that Django Unchained would be better off if the sensitivity readers at Sweet Baby Inc. were able to edit the script so they could center blackness or whatever buzzword bullshit they would come up with. Or maybe he just didn't do any research into the group, I don't know. But in his video, he whitewashes the group and presents zero evidence as to why people would have an issue with Sweet Baby Inc.
As a result, a Steam group was made that ended up having over 350,000 followers directly meant to target Sweet Baby Inc. and encourage people not to buy any games related to them. In addition to this, a Discord server was made to directly target employees of Sweet Baby Inc. and also any games they were involved in. This led to an entire harassment campaign that was all but egged on by a lot of anti-woke grifter reviewers on YouTube and other platforms. For context, Sweet Baby Inc. is a 16-person team, and at this point, they were being targeted by around over 300,000 people and being sent death threats and other things that I'm not going to mention here. It was all a big mess, and a lot of people compared it to how Gamergate functioned in the mid-2010s, since that was another very notable harassment campaign led by alt-right people attacking diversity.
As always, harassment of individuals is not okay, but that should be placed in a separate category compared to people boycotting games worked on by Sweet Baby Inc.
A good amount of the anti-woke grifter channels got in on this, of course, choosing to spread their own agenda under the guise of quote-unquote criticism.
To spread their own agenda? Have we not seen the clips of Sweet Baby Inc.? All these channels were attempting to do is to call out a company which was pushing its own agenda.
Which was once a badge of honor for these various developers to say how woke they are. It is now associated with their downfall, and a lot of them are trying to remove any trace or connection to this company because it is a revenue killer.
So it's funny they say that, because the only game that Sweet Baby Inc. had any sort of involvement in that can be quantified as a very clear flop is actually Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. That game was a big disaster, but it had nothing to do with any quote-unquote woke agenda.
Sweet Baby Inc. has a mostly mixed track record, with games such as Gotham Knights, Flintlock, and South of Midnight underperforming, along with Suicide Squad. Regardless of the financial performance, a clear message was sent by gamers that they do not want such a group working on games.
They've also tried to say the exact same thing about Marvel's Spider-Man 2, which honestly makes even less sense to me. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? None other than the poster child for anti-woke film criticism decided to try and get in on anti-woke game criticism as well. You guessed it, the Critical Drinker made an entire video about Sweet Baby Inc. Oh boy. And you bet he had to speak on their clearly very obvious involvement in Marvel's Spider-Man 2 and how it totally pushed a woke agenda in that game.
The thing is, Honeyed Infant now have carte blanche to come in and rewrite your new game in any way they see fit, because their word is basically law now. And because all they really care about is making themselves feel better by lecturing the rest of the world about social and political issues that specifically matter to them, they begin to make changes. Lots of changes.
It is fairly difficult to parse out which specific parts Sweet Baby Inc. worked on and what they have not, as that information is not public, so making general claims like this is something I would avoid. But when the guiding philosophy and approach to storytelling are so clearly objectionable, it's inevitable that people would not want this company working on games.
Got a legacy straight white male hero that's been hugely popular and the mainstay of your franchise for years? Well, clearly he needs to go in favour of someone more diverse and worthy, who we're going to take every possible opportunity to remind the audience is better than straight white male hero in every possible way. But how exactly to get rid of him? Well, let's just say he's gone off to find himself because he got sad or something. You know, whatever, as long as he's out of the picture, that's all that really matters.
Okay, there are already several very obvious things wrong with what Drinker says about Marvel's Spider-Man 2. First off, Peter Parker actually hasn't been the consistent main star of the Marvel Spider-Man franchise, even though that's what he says here. Because 2 years after the first game came out in 2018, Miles Morales got his own game as a PS5 launch title. So no, Peter Parker has not been the mainstay of the Marvel Spider-Man franchise for years, despite what Drinker says here. In addition to this, Miles does not outright replace Peter at the game's end. Peter makes the choice to focus on his new life with MJ for a while since they just moved and are just settling down. After an alien symbiote invasion nearly killed all of New York, I can see why he'd want to rest. And Miles is just being a genuine friend to him by letting him settle down with the love of his life. There is really nothing unearned about that at all. If anything, by the game's end, you really feel like that Peter has earned this vacation. And he's not even retiring as Spider-Man, he says he'll still pick up the mantle whenever he's needed again.
It seems that Drinker is talking about the Spider-Man franchise as a whole, given that he says long-standing. I don't think 2 games fits that criteria. And it's a reasonable position to have. If, for example, the third Batman game developed by Rocksteady had Bruce Wayne take a vacation so that Tim Drake could take on the mantle and fight crime, I would be less excited. The same philosophy applies to this situation.
Got a bunch of attractive female characters in your game that appeal to your mostly male fanbase? Not on their watch. If the women in your game don't look like they've taken a couple of dozen bee stings to the face and gone into anaphylactic shock, then you clearly need to re-examine your internal biases. Because as we all know, the reason that people like Sydney Sweeney are so popular right now is that we're all fascinated by her geopolitical takes on the current military situation in Ukraine.
I'll be completely honest, this also isn't true. One of the things the original 2018 Spider-Man game was actually praised for was not really honing in on Mary Jane's sexuality and making her look more plain and just fleshing out her personality instead. And Spider-Man 2 also follows suit by just kind of making her look like a normal woman. Like, to me, that's kind of what Mary Jane looks like in these 2 games, just like a normal woman. But if it's not some thick-thighed dominatrix with her tits pouring out, apparently these guys think it's automatically bad.
Isn't the point of Mary Jane to be the bombshell? Part of their relationship is that it's fairly unexpected for a nerdy guy like Peter Parker to end up with such a beautiful woman. And why is it praiseworthy to make her less beautiful? What logic is that? Why not make an attractive character model and also focus more on her personality? You can chew gum and walk at the same time. But OtterlyNoah said that making Mary Jane less attractive was praiseworthy. This seems to be a further continuation of the push to make characters less attractive. Continuing the long-standing push stemming back a decade at this point, which started with Anita Sarkeesian. Many individuals will attempt a revisionist history and state that this was never the case, but these people defended her arguments and propagated them as well. It's important to not forget the fact that the woke crowd was pushing back against sexy female characters for a very long time, and only switched up because it became unpopular to be the one complaining from an optics perspective. I understand that recently a lot of anti-woke criticism is not great, especially as we will see later. But I'm not going to pretend that for the past decade, woke people were not demanding that games conform to their own standards. Less sexy female characters, pushing inclusion and diversity even in contexts where it makes no sense or is against the artist's vision, and in general demanding less offensive content and more politically correct narratives, or as the employee from Sweet Baby Inc. said, narratives that only offend the right people. Let's not forget the insane backlash to Hogwarts Legacy.
Capcom put out a remaster for Onimusha 2. Onimusha is one of Capcom's flagship action-adventure series, which takes place in Japanese mythology. And Onimusha 2 was released in HD on modern platforms. And overall, reviews are pretty positive for it, since it's just a simple HD remaster, but makes it accessible for modern audiences. But can you guess who wasn't excited about it? You guessed it, the anti-woke grifters. Somehow, they decided to try and find reasons to call a game from over 20 years ago woke, when nobody was saying that when it came out. Specifically, they're getting mad at two scenes that Capcom seemingly censored in this game.
Now, this is where scale comes into play. I am not pro-censorship, and I don't see the point of going out of your way to get rid of these scenes or do more work to cover this up. Why? Recently, there's been more and more of a push to censor and just remove the problematic elements of media, such as removing an episode of Community for being too offensive. This is a situation where the underlying point is correct, but that optically tone matters a lot here.
There is actually an entire list on Steam, an entire Steam community dedicated to listing out games you shouldn't play because they are quote-unquote woke. Yes, you heard that right. There is a list with over 1,600 games on it, in fact. This was actually the biggest reason I wanted to make this video because I find it so baffling that anyone would dedicate their time to making a list this gargantuan just because they think so many games are woke and that you shouldn't play them. Unbelievable.
I will say this. The anti-woke gaming list is stupid. Many of the games are perfectly fine, and even if there is one or two things that could end up being annoying, throwing the whole game out is a fairly stupid thing to do. I will agree with OtterlyNoah here. These lists are fairly easy for anyone to go through and debunk. It additionally makes it harder when actual egregious decisions are made and pushback is necessary, as the opposition could just point to the list and say, these people are not worth listening to anyway. Look at what upsets them. Despite the excesses of the anti-woke movement, it is still fighting back against those pushing their own brand of outrage that has been going on for a decade. Even if some character designs and more offensive content is being released, it stands in stark opposition to what these people have been pushing for over a decade now. And the attempts to engage in revisionist history and say that this push never existed is a fairly laughable notion. Whatever faults and excesses exist with some anti-woke gaming talking points, it pales in comparison to what others have said and pushed for in games. Just think about how many games you played and enjoyed that couldn't be released today due to quote-unquote problematic elements.
One thing that was reported upon when the console officially launched was the changes made to the Mii Maker system. On previous Nintendo systems, when booting up the Mii Maker, you would get a choice between two different starter Miis that you could customize to your liking later on, one being labeled a boy Mii and the other being labeled a girl Mii. However, for Nintendo Switch 2, Nintendo has dropped those two labels, although the Miis they give you are the same exact Miis they've used in previous versions of the Mii Maker. But unfortunately, all it took were these two pieces of news about Nintendo embracing DIE and also the changes to the Mii Maker for the anti-woke grifters to get pretty upset. One such anti-woke grifter who made a video talking about how he thinks Nintendo was all woke propaganda now was Dr. Disaster. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
Nintendo has kowtowed to the gender politics at a base level on their new console. It looks as though the Mii characters are now being made genderless. Now, we thought we'd seen it all, but Nintendo appears to have bowed down and listened to the woke bozos who run Nintendo of America these days. They, as a company, are once again utterly late to the party on this sort of thing, considering how far gamers have veered away from these politics in recent years.
I find it funny he tries to say that Nintendo is late to the party on woke politics or whatever, when, in actuality, these are just the same two Miis they always use in their Mii makers. Whenever you boot up Mii Maker, whether it's on 3DS, Wii, Wii U, or Switch, you always get two Miis to start with for your template, and Nintendo Switch 2 is doing the exact same thing here. These are quite literally the same two Miis Nintendo has always provided for starter Miis, but it seems Dr. Disaster doesn't quite understand that.
When it comes to pronouns in the character creator, I don't care. But let's not pretend there's not an equally unhinged mob that will throw a tantrum whenever a traditional character creator exists. The CEO of CI Games SE, developers of Lords of the Fallen 2, went on X, formerly known as Twitter, to take a poll to see what the community wanted in terms of changes. He issued a variety of polls and stated that whichever direction the players chose, the development team would implement them. The results came in and players wanted a male/female option as well as a few other things. In addition, Mirk Tominsky stated that the development team would be looking to hire the best of the best and would take a merit-based approach to onboard new members of the development team, rather than a DEI-focused approach. And, well, would you look at that, he was banned from the Lords of the Fallen 2 subreddit, in which the mods of the subreddit called him a fascist. Because apparently, hiring based purely on talent and having a male/female option is fascist now. Are there people who will get upset at the removal of pronouns? Yes. But the people who are pushing to remove them in the first place are more unhinged, and it's demonstrated when the decision is reversed.
Interestingly enough, while he's called Nintendo woke in a lot of his videos over the past 2 months, Dr. Disaster actually has the opposite opinion when it comes to another video game. In particular, when it comes to Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater Delta, which is a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater that's set to come out next month. I find this very interesting because he claims that this game, which is set to be an exact remake of the original Snake Eater, is not woke. Which, if you know anything about the original Snake Eater game, you probably know where this is going. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
But at least some studios these days are starting to realize that the actual audience for video games has a particular demographics to it. Gamers are mostly male, and funny enough, even the female gamers out there, who certainly do exist, but even they mostly prefer to see masculine male characters and feminine females, meaning that generally, if these studios would simply make things that appeal to dudes, they would sell a lot more games. That appears to be the conclusion that Konami has reached with the upcoming Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater. But the thing is, this is a game that has avoided controversy, unlike so many of these other studios these days that go out of their way to embrace woke shit and piss off a massive chunk of the gamers out there.
So, according to Dr. Disaster, there is nothing quote-unquote woke about Metal Gear whatsoever. So, you're telling me that a series that is pretty blatantly anti-capitalist and anti-military in just a critique of the military-industrial complex overall, and one that just so happens to feature a bunch of confirmed LGBT characters isn't quote-unquote woke in your opinion? Because it sounds to me like those are the exact kinds of things that you guys would normally call quote-unquote woke, but it's funny you're not calling it that here. Things like Horizon Zero Dawn and The Last of Us 2, two games you guys often get mad at for being quote-unquote woke, actually explore a lot of the same things that Metal Gear Solid does and has been for a while. So I find it pretty interesting that you guys always call those games that just so happen to feature a female protagonist quote-unquote woke, but not this one, which happens to feature a male protagonist, but still explores a lot of the same themes that you guys call quote-unquote woke all the time. Hypocrite much? Ultimately, the reason why Dr. Disaster isn't calling Metal Gear Solid 3 quote-unquote woke, even though by his criteria it probably should be seen as such, is because it has his idealized version of a male protagonist in it. Solid Snake is a strong, competent, stealthy guy with a beard. He's not a female character or a person of color, so there's no real reason for Dr. Disaster to try to sell you on the idea that Metal Gear Solid is quote-unquote woke, even though by his criteria it technically is. This just kinda goes to show that these anti-woke critics will only single out something and call it quote-unquote woke when it meets their own particular agenda. There's no real criticism to be found here whatsoever.
Political stories are fine. Many of the stories we consume deal with larger thematics and conflict, and with enough degrees of separation, you can always connect a conflict to some larger theme and classify it as politics. The difference between a compelling narrative infused with political themes and woke storytelling is in its execution. Whereas one has carefully considered themes and stakes weaved into the narrative fabric itself, inciting thought and discussion, the other is a ham-fisted, unnuanced lecture that pulls people out of the narrative and detracts from the entertainment value. Stories exist on a spectrum. There are varying degrees of how political a narrative can be, and even how people engage with the politics of the narrative itself. Let's take a look at a previous example, Battlefield 5. Whereas yes, the conflict known as the Second World War is inherently political, is that then a license to cram in some ham-fisted representation contrary to history itself, just to find emotional catharsis to represent the way you wish the war looked like, rather than what it was just to fit your politics. No, shoehorning in your gender politics, which leads to altering the history of World War II, will destroy the player's immersion, as they are witnessing an aesthetic change made for political reasons rather than an authentic depiction of what happened to satisfy the politics of our current time. Execution matters, and when done well it can resonate universally, or when done poorly can be a spiteful, divisive story. But these nuances again exist on a spectrum. It's not just an on-off switch.
Interestingly enough, it's not even just Japanese video games that these anti-woke grifters will get mad at. They've also gotten mad at anime as well before. One anime they've actually gotten mad at is a slightly more unknown one called The Cafe Terrace and Its Goddesses. This is a pretty simple slice of life anime where a young boy inherits his grandmother's cafe where a bunch of young girls work as maids. He must work together with these girls to get the cafe back into tip-top shape and make his grandmother proud. A few different anti-woke grifters got mad at this anime, and not really for the right reasons at all. Let's take a look at one of the videos that was talking about it.
I had no idea that I was going to be making a video on this, but as you can see from the screen, I've been watching certain anime. I despise the premise that is apparently a common trope in anime, where you have the main character get beat up by one or more of the female characters. I cannot stand it. I don't think I've ever been as off-put by a show as I have been with this one, just immediately on that premise.
But I think the thing I find more interesting about this is that he thinks the fact that this scene features a man getting beat up by a bunch of girls is somehow woke propaganda. No, that's really not what this is at all. It's just this show's attempt at a gag or joke. Anime has a history of this in general, sort of mixing fan service to try and create a sense of comedy, like in this scene here. Admittedly, I've never found this sort of thing personally funny, and I don't really find it funny in this scene either, but I can see they're trying to make it come off as a joke. It's just sort of a common thing in anime to do this overall. There's no woke propaganda going on here at all, so I'm not sure why he's trying to claim that. It doesn't really make any sense.
Is this really worth putting into the video? This video has 177 views. I doubt this represents any significant portion of the anti-woke crowd, but I will agree with OtterlyNoah, this is stupid. But this is just one guy.
He's actually not the only one who's gotten mad at an anime before and called it woke propaganda. Another very similar thing has actually happened before with Nerdrotic, who is basically the second poster child for anti-woke criticism next to the critical drinker. In particular, Nerdrotic did a review of Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim, which is an anime film made by Warner Brothers back in 2024. This film was very loosely based off of some of the appendices in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings novels, and honestly, there are a lot of problems with it, but as you can probably imagine, it stars a female main character. So you can probably already imagine where Nerdrotic's take on this is gonna go. Let's see what he had to say.
Up until now, I was going lighter and giving OtterlyNoah some benefit of the doubt. That ends here. Nerdrotic's point is a lot deeper than just protagonist is a girl, therefore bad. In fact, as Nerdrotic knows quite a bit about Middle-earth, his opinion has more to do with lore. In this section, OtterlyNoah skips over Nerdrotic's criticism, reasoning, and evidence. Nerdrotic's chief claim being that Hera's inclusion in the narrative goes against what Tolkien wrote and derails a narrative that never considered her in the first place.
Amazon isn't the only company that can create insufferable characters in Tolkien's work that take away screen time from actual characters that were written about.
Not simply that Hera is a girl, therefore bad. Skipping over the crux of his argument to attack a straw man is pure incompetence or just arguing in bad faith to an audience you know won't go back to watch his original video. One small detail that should be acknowledged is Noah's statement that this is a loose adaptation. Thus far, this is the most clever thing Noah has done. Which is not saying much, but it's still worth digging into. This phrase will be the crux of Noah's argumentation. However, given how War of the Rohirrim does deviate from the lore, it is in effect a loose adaptation. But the connotation between how Nerdrotic utilizes this in his video and what Noah is saying now could not be more different. Nerdrotic is criticizing the film for being a loose adaptation. Throughout his review, he will point out unnecessary changes made to the story that detract from the quality of Tolkien's original narrative. OtterlyNoah uses the phrase loose adaptation to sidestep much of Nerdrotic's criticism, attempting to avoid dealing with Nerdrotic's specific examples and substantive writing objections. Nerdrotic's chief issue is that Hera is almost an entirely fabricated character inserted poorly into the story where she takes center stage, which in the process takes away from other characters.
Now, War of the Rohirrim had plenty of time to flesh out named characters in the appendices like Helm's sons, Haleth and Hama. Unfortunately, that would take away time from the completely made up by Warner Brothers characters. Is this starting to sound familiar? And unfortunately, they're both relegated to not even guest star status, barely side character status.
Legitimate criticism. Giving specific examples of other actual named and involved characters in the narrative that suffer because of Hera's forced inclusion. By having a character that is extremely competent in almost all areas, she's not compelling on her own. And given that she's the main character, that's a major problem.
Now there might be some people out there who don't think Hera is a girl boss and or a Mary Sue, and to that I say... Here are just some of Hera's accomplishments in War of the Rohirrim, and you're gonna have to forgive me, I'm going off the top of my head because I'm not gonna watch this again. And it also goes without mentioning that she comes with every Mary Sue-ism, including but not limited to, she's an accomplished climber, she's an accomplished sword fighter, she's the fastest rider, she's headstrong, a brilliant strategist, and everyone likes her. Hera's the first to discover a Southron in Rohan and in Oliphant. That Hera is able to kill when Freyalaf tries to save her, but she ends up saving him. During the attack on Edoras, Hera is able to kill her second Oliphant. Now her brother Haleth kills in Oliphant too, but then he gets killed celebrating, stupid male. Instead of seeing the actual best part of the story, Helm killing men with his bare hands in the long winter, we see him face off against a couple of orcs and a troll who are collecting rings from the dead. For Sauron, no, not that Sauron, this Sauron. Helm shows up to save Hera, and then Hera saves him by killing the troll. She talks to the eagles, who of course come in later and save the day. She sets up a trap for Wolf, and then defeats him and kills him in one-on-one combat.
You think I am afraid of you?
You should be.
And I didn't get to everything, but it's pretty clear that Hera is solely responsible for saving all of Rohan, but that doesn't make the annals of history.
He goes further in depth, comparing what happens in the appendices versus War of the Rohirrim. In fact, Hera accomplishes the very feats that other characters do.
Now, canonically, it's Helm's nephew, Freyalaf, who kills Wolf, who is eventually crowned king of Rohan, but it wouldn't be a Mary Sue story if we didn't have the guy who Hera stole the valor from telling her she should be queen.
And then somehow, the story has to give a botched explanation as to why you never heard of Hera in the first place.
Where she says, don't look for tales for her in the old songs, there are none. And considering what she achieves in this film, I don't even know how that's possible.
But the inclusion of Hera is not just incompetence. It stems from an ideological push to fix Tolkien's work. It's not as if the writers just rolled the dice to see who would be the main character and it landed on the number corresponding to Hera. Hera's expanded role, her characterization, and her feats are all in service of the attempt to modernize Tolkien's lore. The usual crowd has been complaining for a while about how Tolkien's lore is outdated, whether it be the portrayal of POC, the old school values, and in this case the lack of strong female characters. And instead of just accepting Tolkien's lore for what it is and creating a faithful adaptation, instead many have chosen to bend Middle-earth to their own ideological vision and then attempt to portray it as what was always written. In essence, an attempt to canonize their own fan fiction. This is what Nerdrotic is objecting to. Now, let's see OtterlyNoah's criticism.
Warner Brothers couldn't possibly make the same mistakes as Amazon, like wildly deviating from the lore, making up characters that end up subverting the characters that are actually written in the story, and they couldn't possibly go with a girl boss, could they? Well, now that I've seen the film, they went with a girl boss.
So, no, the thing that brought this movie under was not the fact that it featured a quote-unquote girl boss. Something like Prey features a quote-unquote girl boss, as a lot of these anti-woke grifters would call it, and is actually a good movie and was well received. Having a female main character is never the thing that brings a movie down.
Hopefully we can see the difference between an adaptation and an original screenplay. War of the Rohirrim is based off a story in which Hera plays no significant role, versus Prey, which is an original story, so you have the freedom to do what you want. I really can't believe I have to explain why one premise is okay and the other is not. And supposedly to someone who has media literacy.
What does bring Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim down, however, is pretty much everything else and all the things that really matter when making a film. The animation in this film is incredibly shoddy looking and really cheap, and you can tell they just rushed it.
But he does talk about the animation. It's not the focus of the review, because he's, breaking down why this film fails as an adaptation, but he does discuss these points.
As a matter of fact, this entire movie was rushed because it was swept out into theaters in order to meet a deadline so that Warner Brothers didn't lose the rights to Lord of the Rings to adapt it to film. Their contract states they have to release a Lord of the Rings film in theaters every so often in order to hold on to the rights, so that's exactly why this film exists. There was no passion or love put into this film at all. It basically just exists as a corporate checkmark so they can hold on to the rights for the films. It has nothing to do with the fact that it features a female main character. It has everything to do with the fact that why it exists to begin with. But Nerdrotic doesn't really seem to understand that and is honestly focusing on the wrong thing here.
Time marched on, and quickly we realized what was really going on behind the scenes at Amazon and Warner Brothers. A giant corporate dick measuring contest, which I was all for. Sure, the only reason Warner Brothers greenlit War of the Rohirrim was to retain the distribution rights in their fight with Amazon.
I think there are actually a lot of other things you could say about Hera in this film, because I personally have a lot of issues with this movie overall. None of which have to do with the fact it features a female protagonist. Like I said before, the cheap animation is definitely a huge turnoff for me, but I also think the story is just super underwhelming.
You said you had problems with Hera, but then just shifted to a very generic criticism of the story being underwhelming.
For those unaware, this film is actually adapting 3 pages of an appendices in Lord of the Rings that actually talks about the origin of Helm's Deep. The story is pretty short given it's only 3 pages, but the thing is, this film felt the need to stretch that out into 2 hours and 14 minutes. That makes the pacing of the film feel super off as opposed to the original story it's based on, and honestly, this story is just stretched super thin here to fit a 2 hour and 14 minute mark.
The music is as flat as the characters and the animation, but this film's biggest crime is it's a boring slog. It clocks in at over 2 hours, cut down from 2.5 hours when it was originally supposed to be 90 minutes.
There are so many other more legitimate things you could throw at Lord of the Rings War of the Rohirrim as real criticisms, but Nerdrotic just isn't doing that. He just wants to try and pinpoint the fact that this film has a female protagonist as its main downfall when that's just not really the case at all.
So, taking issue with the blatant insert who derails the narrative and takes away focus from the important characters in the canon is not legitimate criticism. I mean, your viewers would not know that given you cut all those parts out of your video. At this point, if you remade Lord of the Rings and had Arwen take lead on the Fellowship, gave her a giant battle axe and armor, and had her cleave her way to Mount Doom and throw the ring into the fire herself, you couldn't criticize that because it's a woman. And if you did, you would just be sexist, and then OtterlyNoah would make a video saying you don't have media literacy. That is actually the logic here. In the previous hypothetical case, you could break down the various story elements that don't work as a result, how it breaks continuity while making little sense, and attack the motivation that had the writers make such crappy decisions, which is what Nerdrotic did in this review, and others have as well. Much like in real life, things exist on a spectrum. There is a middle ground where in a certain sequence Hera could have had an expanded role, similar to how in Lord of the Rings trilogy they replaced Glorfindel with Arwen. This worked because it gave more time with the character as well as establishing character traits and giving a strong introduction to the elves. But you're not going to get this type of criticism from these critics. These critics will just skip over lore and the substantive conversations and just talk about the animation because they don't want to criticize the female character, regardless of how badly she was written, and the motivations that blatantly inserted her in the first place. Well, yeah, if you skip over the part where they do criticize how the story doesn't work, then yeah, you could just say these things. The rest of this video is a lolly discussion which we're not going to get into. Additionally, he goes on to criticize this guy, and I'm not going to defend him, as again, I would side more with OtterlyNoah's arguments in this specific section. Increasingly, however, anti-woke critics are not just simply critics you might happen to disagree with. At the end of the day, it's not difficult at all to find reviewers and critics who fall on the other side. Critics who oftentimes are far more vocal about their politics and won't shy away from said discussions in their own reviews, which often end up being more political than the creators we have taken a look at in this video. Thus, a new vector of attack has been created. These are no longer critics you disagree with, these are grifters.
Rather than actually dissecting why they don't like a piece of media, they'll usually just give some superficial reason as to why they think it's woke propaganda or whatever buzzword term they might happen to have handy at the time. They'll usually pick out things that really don't matter at the end of the day when it comes to critical analysis, like getting mad at the Daniel Craig James Bond films for having a black version of Moneypenny, or getting mad at the latest Predator film for having a Native American woman in the lead role. But now this begs the question, what is grifting and what is real criticism, and how can we know how to spot either one? Well, that's exactly what I want to discuss today.
Some of these are issues, but they don't derail a whole film. For example, in the newest Batman film, Jim Gordon is race-swapped. Now, this is an issue, but I would not go on to call the entire film woke as a result. I would just take issue with this specific casting choice. This is often the case.
If I really wanted to be a grifter, I wouldn't be giving something like Pixar's Elio a good review in a video to itself. If you look at the most viewed videos on Elio from the time it came out, especially from those that are generally seen as grifters from the majority of perspectives out there, you can see that the videos that went all in on bashing Elio got a lot of viewership. Bashing Elio superficially without really dissecting what may or may not have worked about the film is something that was sold very easily by a lot of grifters around this time.
And these professional Disney photographers, the guy who took Michael Eisner's board pictures, taught us how to take pictures the Disney way, but it's called the rule of thirds. While watching Elio, I couldn't help but notice throughout 80% of the movie, all the action was in the dead center of the screen. Would you concur with that, Chris?
Yes.
And it just seems like Elio and Pixar and Disney, especially with Wish, they decided that they were going to take their movie and just violate all the rules of art.
Now, it is one thing to make a film that isn't well written and is not interesting, but what I want to talk about first is the animation. Now, I heard a review going into this video that also called Elio the worst Pixar movie ever made, and that video really just narrowed in on the animation and how this movie completely abandons basic animation and filmmaking principles. Then you will know this very basic rule, the rule of thirds. What is the rule of thirds? It's that you should position your character, your subject, your action in the either left or right third of the screen. Why? Because it forces the audience's eye to move to that angle. It forces them to move to whatever off-center angle it is and continuously engage with the action. Because yes, everything in Elio is portrayed dead center in the film, to a distracting level, to an almost comical level.
I find it so funny that Film Threat initially brings up the supposed criticism of Elio by talking about the rule of thirds, even though that really has nothing to do with the quality of the film or the story, since a lot of acclaimed Pixar films actually break this rule as well, and then of course Jester Bell decides to go ahead and try to parrot this talking point that doesn't make any sense to begin with. Really just shows a lot about how these guys really think about criticism.
You know, even after I think I'm done and I have everything wrapped up, I find new objections constantly and other ways OtterlyNoah has lied. The clip OtterlyNoah played of Film Threat is not their actual review. This video that he's playing is not their actual review. Their actual review is a separate video, which he conveniently didn't mention. The video he's playing is a specific rant that one of the writers at Film Threat made, specifically only talking about the rule of thirds. The reason OtterlyNoah didn't mention their actual review was because in that video, they actually break down the film from a myriad of perspectives and state for them why it didn't work.
Elio takes place in space. Somehow Pixar managed to make space look boring.
Yeah.
It's like, if I were to imagine Pixar doing space, you would see galaxies, you'd see stars. It would feel three-dimensional. It would feel crisp and clean, meaning you could see every star, every singular star. But in this one, it just felt like something that you get out of a children's textbook or something like that.
As for Jester Bell, just quote-unquote parroting the talking points, you know what? At least she mentioned that she noticed this from another video. She referenced the video she got it from, which is far more than I can say for you, Noah, which we'll get to later.
And really, the majority of the content made on Elio from these people, even the ones that were phrased as actual reviews, didn't really come off as real reviews at all. Rather than actually looking at Elio as a film and talking about the things that really matter when reviewing a film, such as storytelling, pacing, characterization, and things like that, they were just talking about things like box office numbers and the fact that the film previously had queer themes in it that they didn't like. If I'd really wanted to be a grifter, I probably would have done the same thing here, but I personally liked Elio, and so I gave it a good review and left it at that.
This is not a review. This is a clip from the pop culture news podcast, The Real BBC. They are reviewing and giving commentary over an article. In fact, most of the examples you gave are not even reviews of the film. Critical Drinker does not have a review on Elio. Nerdrotic does not have a review of Elio. He again has a clip from his podcast where he discusses the film's box office. You know why they don't have these points in their review? Because they never reviewed the film in the first place.
It's also this constant seeking for mass attention and wanting to have the biggest platform possible to push their own agenda that leads them to not even cover any classic or underrated cinema. You will only ever see these guys cover current popular American mainstream movies rather than things that could be more niche and more interesting to talk about and highlight. This is something that I, and a lot of others, routinely make a point of doing. As someone who just loves film, I would like more people to get invested into lesser known projects. Ultimately, the grifters won't do that because, let's face it, that's not something that would get them clicks. Constantly talking about mainstream American films is the easiest way for them to get instant clicks and continue to sell this lie to their audience.
And now we just continue to lie. This was the image OtterlyNoah put up as grifters who don't review anything outside of the mainstream. Let's take a look at their channels. A 2-second glance at Aaron Underwood's channel shows someone who has reviewed all types of media. Going to Critical Drinker's channel, you can see he reviews all types of media.
One of the reasons I started the Extra Shots series was to draw attention to older, more offbeat and inventive movies that perhaps didn't get the attention they deserved.
In fact, a YouTuber, YMS, called Drinker out for the same thing OtterlyNoah did on a livestream. He later went on to EFAP, a podcast hosted by Mahler, Fringy, and Rags. When confronted on his statements about Drinker, YMS had to walk back his claims.
When I made this video, I was under the impression that his recommendations were purely limited to the ones with recommends in the title. And then between, you messaging me and me being on this stream, I'd scroll down the channel a bit, trying to see if I could maybe get in one or two more videos before having this conversation. And I noticed that there's other videos where he's recommending other films that are just not, I scrolled down the list using the search term recommends because I thought that that's how he categorized his videos, but there were a bunch more. And also, I will also say this. I read the title of Boiling Point, but I got it confused with the movie Hard Boiled. And Boiling Point is a lesser known movie. that I haven't seen yet that I would like to, you know. But yeah, I mean, like I said at the beginning of the stream, that was one of my misconceptions that I can easily give you a point on. He recommended a lot more things than what I scrolled through because it was categorized under a different title.
Okay,
so
cool.
I'm not going to try to argue that like he doesn't check out things that are, you know, against the grain or you know, smaller films that aren't explicitly Disney films. That was a misconception on my part. So man, like, it's not untrue what he's saying, but it reflects like a very narrow media diet. You know, it reflects a very narrow consumption of films, which is always like that's like most of the issue I have with like, you know, the types of reviews that the critical drinker makes are kind of like the types of reviews that like Ben Shapiro makes, where it's like you're subjecting yourself to like very few films in a year. Like, of course you're gonna be mad at them.
And that's when you do you feel the same way about, or did you say that you?
No, I concede he exposes himself to more films than I previously thought.
All it takes is a simple look at Drinker's main and second channel to find a plethora of reviews and breakdowns of non-current mainstream media. But I guess it's just easier to lie. OtterlyNoah goes on to call out Altiori for her take on Witcher 4, where she decided to complain that Ciri took over from Geralt in the upcoming Witcher game. The issue is that this does seem to make sense from a lore perspective. I will agree with Noah here. Just because there is a large trend does not mean you can avoid looking at each specific case against the facts. Altiori jumped in without fully knowing the facts, and this was a bad video.
The person who's pretty much the poster child for anti-woke or bad faith criticism on YouTube is the Critical Drinker. A lot of his videos are poised as movie reviews when really they're not really reviewing the movie at all and just trying to create anti-woke propaganda constantly.
You're literally scrolling past a bunch of films which he reviewed, in which he talks about various aspects of the film. And then somehow you still state he doesn't really review the movies in his film reviews.
Much like all these grifters, Drinker always hits the same talking points and keeps hitting the same stone over and over, like trying to crap on the same people constantly, like Brie Larson or Rachel Ziegler, and probably his favorite one, Daisy Ridley. He even reviewed a rather obscure movie of hers from earlier this year that was basically a Die Hard clone with her having an autistic brother in it. Of course, the fact that there was an autistic person in this movie is the reason why I personally went to see it, and I was the only one in the theater. But inevitably, Drinker will just go to see any movie that happens to have Daisy Ridley in it to try to find a way to crap on it. Wow.
You fucking liar. Since Rise of Skywalker, Daisy Ridley has been in a number of films. Drinker has not reviewed the vast majority of them, but it's easier to lie to sell your narrative about a reviewer you disagree with than honestly contend with their work. Drinker did not review Sometimes I Think About Dying, The Marsh King's Daughter, Young Woman in the Sea, and finally We Buried the Dead. The Cleaners seems to be a fairly stupid Die Hard clone, and the Drinker thought it would be a good bit of fun to review the film. It's not as if he has been constantly hounding Daisy Ridley in all of her roles since The Rise of Skywalker.
One thing I want to do here, though, is take a look at one of his most notorious reviews, that being his review of Glass Onion. For those unaware, Drinker made a notoriously very bad faith review of Glass Onion simply because he doesn't like Rian Johnson, the man who directed this film.
Oh no, Glass Onion. Okay.
Also, for those somehow not in the know, Rian Johnson directed The Last Jedi, which is basically every anti-woke grifter's favorite punching bag. So, of course, therein lies the motivation for Drinker to basically bash any film that Rian Johnson directs. He also did the same thing with the first Knives Out as well. However, it was his Glass Onion review that gained a lot of notoriety for him just straight up lying about different scenes in order to sell this idea that Rian Johnson is consistently a terrible filmmaker. He does this all throughout this review, but one of the most notable examples is where he's talking about the scene where Blanc spots Dave Bautista's character seeing his girlfriend in an affair with Miles. In particular, he tries to claim that Rian rewrote this scene because he's a bad filmmaker and a total hack. When in actuality, if you play these scenes with the sound on, which mysteriously enough, when Drinker decided to talk about this, he muted these clips, you can actually see exactly why it shows up like this.
You absolute fucking liar. I am sick and tired of this idiot blindly repeating talking points, which is what seems like an absolute dereliction of scrutiny. Actually, scratch that. By now I am positive OtterlyNoah does not even have the intellectual capacity to think his words through. Essentially, OtterlyNoah is repeating a criticism originally made by Pillar of Garbage. As I said in a previous video in which I responded to another YouTuber recycling Pillar of Garbage's video, Critical Drinker did not mute the audio. He has replaced the film's audio with his own voice recording to show his analysis of the scene.
Like this scene where Bautista is watching his girlfriend supposedly having an affair with Miles only to be observed by Blanc. Now look at the later version of this exact same scene. Notice how Helen's been added in here when she totally should have been visible before.
With this logic, he has manipulated every other scene he has discussed in his review. Hell, everyone is manipulating footage with this logic. And we are talking about a twig snap audio cue that takes place 1 hour apart, a fairly easy detail to miss. Now, This is where I owe my viewers an apology. I strive to be accurate in my videos and to generate well thought out arguments. Unfortunately, when I previously discussed this same topic, I made a mistake. I stated that Pillar of Garbage was correct and the Critical Drinker made a mistake. It is then in my comment section that someone directed me to a video by Fair's Fair. Please check out his channel as he does excellent work. In his video, he dives into the matter and actually is able to prove that the scene was manipulated and the woman should have been visible partially when she was not.
So buckle your seatbelts and try to keep up. This is going to get confusing fast. Now, Drinker had shown Bugle Bros lean out on his own, then them leaning out together. But as laid out, the single lean happened after the stick sound, while the double lean happened before. This could have just been tricky editing. They cut the double lean out from scene A so that Ally wouldn't be there. This presumes that this bit of them both sticking out was simply not shown to us, and the film decided to purposefully remove a section of the timeline to mislead the audience. Though the end bit should have definitely had the Ally visible over the buff guy's shoulder, so Drinker could still be right, but he only showed the leaning discrepancy. But listen here to the snap that Mound of Refuse used to point out that the two leans were on either side of it. This snap is a unifying piece. But it's the timing on that snap in scene A that kills this debate. The snap sound plays while the camera is facing buff guy, but that sound was made by Ally moving to a new spot from behind this shrub, which means that we absolutely should have seen them leaning out and her moving behind him. The evidence is irrefutable from the very media being discussed. There is now only one option, that the scene was altered to play out differently later to gaslight the audience into believing events had happened in a different way that contradicts what actually did happen.
Although the Critical Drinker was not correct, neither were those criticizing him, and the truth leans more towards the fact that the footage was just lying instead of the clever misdirection Pillar of Garbage says it is. Now, one of the supposed key talking points from those labeling others as grifters is that these grifters will never apologize or retract their claims. Now is OtterlyNoah's chance and others to prove that they can apologize, unlike those they criticize, supposedly. Now, this all depends on how far this video proliferates, and although I'm not a gambling degenerate, if I had to bet, my bet would be on no apology or retraction. Now, if you've watched my videos before, or somebody else's, you may have raised your eyebrow at this point OtterlyNoah made, given that it is a recreation of Pillar of Garbage's point in his Critical Drinker Glass Onion video. However, unlike other YouTubers who cited Pillar of Garbage, OtterlyNoah just took Pillar of Garbage's video, recreated it, and passed it off as his own. Well, it turns out OtterlyNoah is a plagiarist. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. The man who is calling other YouTubers out for making bad content has actually been ripping off other people's work this whole time.
Yeah, the first half or so of this video is pretty much just a fairly inaccurate plot recap, with some incidental Last Jedi hate.
Really milking that one, huh?
But yeah, there's some Star Wars whinging.
Made by a man who gleefully set out to burn one of cinema's most beloved IPs to the ground. Tell me, how's that trilogy coming along, Ryan?
Also, for those somehow not in the know, Rian Johnson directed Last Jedi, which is basically every anti-woke grifter's favorite punching bag.
Except no, that isn't true. There's a reason the Drinker plays these clips on mute. Let me put the sound back on for you. That was the first time we see this. There's a close shot of Duke, then we hear the twig snap, and then we pull back to a shot revealing Blanc. Here's the scene as we're shown it later on. We start with this slightly wider shot, revealing Blanc and Helen, then Helen leaves, causing that sound, and Duke turns round. This point is the moment we saw earlier on, and there's a very obvious, very obtrusive sound cue, the sole purpose of which is to communicate precisely this.
In particular, he tries to claim that Ryan rewrote this scene because he's a bad filmmaker and a total hack. When in actuality, if you play these scenes with the sound on, which mysteriously enough, when Drinker decided to talk about this, he muted these clips, you can actually see exactly why it shows up like this. And didn't go back and rewrite anything here, he gave context to an earlier scene. When we first see this scene with Blanc spotting Dave Bautista's character seeing his girlfriend in an affair, we hear a twig snap. And at first, we're led to assume that it's Blanc that caused this twig to snap when he peeked out from the bush. Later, we're shown more of this scene, and we actually get to see that it was Helen who caused the twig to snap, and she was there watching with Blanc.
Before I continue, I have to address an argument that will inevitably be brought up by those defending Noah. That being, Noah has already admitted to his behavior, apologized for his errors, and implemented a plan to ensure he is no longer plagiarizing creators on the platform. Thus, there is no reason to bring this up. I would ask in the hypothetical, instead of Noah who was caught for plagiarizing, that it was instead Drinker, Nerdrotic, or somebody else. What would Noah and his friends do? They would make video after video until all of the meat was picked off the bone clean. There would be no consideration, no mercy, no quarter given. The idea that he could make video after video criticizing others while simultaneously plagiarizing other YouTubers so brazenly is beyond ironic. Just because, in this case, it's your sacred cow or favorite YouTuber does not mean he is above criticism or it can just be swept under the rug with an underwhelming apology. With that being taken care of, let's dig into what actually happened. This entire saga has a lot of details. I will only be covering the important parts. An additional note is that not every detail will be in chronological order, but overall most events will be. The individuals involved in this situation are numerous. However, one of the chief individuals calling out Noah was a YouTuber named Shamu. With Shamu accusing Noah of plagiarism, some barbs were traded back and forth on Twitter. In some instances, Noah actually claimed that he had the most popular video on the topic, insinuating Shamu was just jealous. Eventually, a few more people were discovered to already have come forward accusing Noah of plagiarism. On the same day, January 27th, a video released by Ryle Kinhouse documented more instances of Noah's plagiarism. For some odd reason, Noah was confident that he didn't do anything wrong. A livestream was soon set up to address the allegations, and, it didn't go well for him at all.
Okay. You're fucking retarded, first of all. Where do you draw the line? How do you know what to credit and what to not credit? Where do you draw the line there? What do you credit and what do you not credit? Where is
My guy, you just called me retarded. I don't think I need to address.
I did call you fucking retarded, dipshit. Did you hear the question after the fact?
I don't know, man. It doesn't really feel like you're.
So I'll fucking repeat myself since you're like a fucking sub fucking 30 IQ piece of shit.
All right.
What is your criteria for crediting shit? Do you have one?
You know,
you having a drink?
I think it's. I feel like that's where this is headed.
I mean, holy shit, I have not seen a beatdown this bad in a while. Noah had on several other creators to address the allegations. The individuals were Dickers, The British Runner, Morau, Nick Andros, and Shamu. I will not be going through this entire livestream, but this video will contain the important segments discussing Noah's egregious plagiarism. The first instance of Noah's plagiarism that is discussed is his use of Shamu's content for his video about Tectone.
Okay, so just to be super clear, because this is my read on the situation. You've set out, seen all the funny Tectone content, or all the Templar content that people are cutting, thought that you'd go in for it as well. Super cool. Your stuff is like anti-woke people, right?
Yeah.
Over half of this video is about Tectone's allegations in the past. It's got nothing to do with his Christian grift. Not really. But you've seen that the Shamu video is popping off, and a lot of people have celebrated it. A lot of people reacted to it on streams. A lot of people have talked about it. He's got an exclusive interview with Tectone, right? And then you've thought, oh, okay, cool. I can condense this.
Wait, he got an interview with Tectone? When was that?
Did you? In the DMs. You've watched the video, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, I thought. Well, he did. I know he DM'd him at one point. I didn't think it was like an interview though.
Yeah, text interview.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
to, ask some questions is what I mean.
All right.
Yeah.
I assumed you meant like over voice.
You've seen that video.
Okay.
You've seen that it's very successful. A lot of people are talking about it, and you think you can summarize that video for like the first chapter of your video, right? And just include it in that.
I don't know.
From there, you've taken the clips from there. You told the story of Tectone, and you've done it predominantly through researching by watching Shamu's video and summarizing it, right?
There was definitely a lot of research that was in his video, but I did pull some things from other places too, like other clips of Tecta.
Okay, but primarily, you've set about to use Shamu's video as a framework to be able to base the first chapter of that video, right?
Yes, that's exactly what happened.
Okay. Now, why did you do that and think that it was fine not to credit Shamu?
Honestly, like
just rewrote in his video and included all the graphics
I genuinely did not think it counted as plagiarism. Like the thing, like he's showing clips of Tectone. Clips of Tectone are not owned by Shamu though.
Yeah, but he's edited them together. He's stitched them together. He's gone out and done the legwork and done the research to be able to point out why these are relevant and to be able to collect them. Watch the archives that are on Plazuka's channel. I mean, you cut out the credit to Plazuka's as well, who's the guy who's archived a lot of this stuff already. So it feels like other people are doing the legwork for a lot of this content, and then you're swooping in at the end, watching Shamu's summarization, and then using that for the basis of yours, and not crediting any of the people along the way.
That that's valid. Then I can understand that.
It comes down. That's the whole problem with not doing like the clear crediting with stuff. Because if you just put things in the description.
Because so far as I'm aware, Shamu, tell me if I'm fucking wrong. All you wanted was a credit in the description, right?
Yeah, I'm literally like not. I let everyone use my stuff, and honestly, a credit in the description is not even good enough for what he did, because he literally just downloaded my video, and you know, if you've edited anything ever, he just used the video file and then uploaded that. Like it's honestly ridiculous.
Because there's more comments that you've made about Shamu as well. You've claimed that he's like a tiny commentary channel who's just really annoyed because your video did better than his. You can understand why that'd piss him off, right?
That definitely makes sense. I think I got caught up in the emotion.
Do you admit that you did, you know, by definition, I guess, plagiarize Shamu's content?
I am more than happy to admit that. Yes, absolutely.
In real time, Noah goes from extremely confident to admitting that he plagiarized Shamu. Notice that Shamu also stated that for what Noah did, a simple citation is not enough given the extent to which Noah ripped his video. This was not just a matter of citation. Do not forget that. Later, after admitting to plagiarism, Noah complains that this whole affair should have been done in private.
Don't know why, because you've said this on Twitter as well. You've cried that people have like made this a public thing. Like, you've done something wrong. In fact, Shamu tried to reach out to you. You claim you never saw those messages, but whatever, we'll call that a wash, okay? Okay. You claim that you never saw them, right? But it's not on other people to come out to you, and they've not done something wrong by speaking about it publicly, right? Because they did speak about it publicly, and you've taken a strong stance that none of this is plagiarism, and that you didn't do anything wrong. Such that initially you did include Nick Andros in the credits for this video, and then you took him out. And so the problem here is not anybody talking about it publicly. The problem has been your response consistently.
Again, kind of like what I think this could have just been an email, though. I would have been happy
what's this
to
point
chat with
worth,
y'all
though?
privately.
Why do they?
We can talk over and over
what's the
about
point you're
what we
making?
can, but we're in a public square right now. It doesn't matter if they could have
No,
talked
hold on.
privately.
Because I've already said that to him, right?
Handle this civilly and in private, yes.
Okay, what's the point? What's the point you're trying to make?
Could have, like, literally, this entire stream could have been, you know, just like an email. That's basically.
Well, first of all, you decided to hold on. Okay. The problem is you decided to stream this, and you've decided to respond to this publicly, right? And you've denied all wrongdoing. So I don't know why you're complaining that people have reached out to you privately. Yeah, now you will.
Until this point.
Like 2 hours ago, you were saying that he was just jealous because you got a higher viewed video.
You were also accusing
him again, because I wasn't really sure after Wargaming Dad stream, but
Stop blaming Wargaming Dad. Stop blaming Wargaming Dad. You are your own person who can come to your own fucking conclusions, okay? The decision and your decisions around all of this and the things that you've said and done are on you. Don't try and blame Wargaming Dad. You are an adult, aren't you?
That is completely valid.
Obviously, the reason for this was to avoid being exposed publicly so Noah could still maintain his reputation. If you look at the chat during this time, you can see his community saying the same thing, and even his friends saying that this should have been done privately. Simultaneously, you can see other individuals calling out the insane sweeping. Then, another example of Noah's plagiarism is brought up. In this case, Noah plagiarized Norel, another YouTuber. Subsequently, Vincent Pavarel's video is discussed when watching Ryle Kittenhouse's breakdown of Noah's plagiarism.
And I'm even skipping on a couple. One of them, Better Man, was a massive box office disaster. But let's not use box office as a metric to determine a film's quality for a moment.
Better Man was actually a pretty decent and unique music biopic about the British singer Robbie Williams that unfortunately ended up being a big flop for Paramount. But let's take a step back and not use box office to determine whether a film is actually good or not, Jester Bell.
Having a unique energy to it, incredible dance sequences,
some absolutely gorgeous dance sequences all throughout.
And an interesting twist of turning the star into a CGI monkey that actually works when you watch the film.
And also a pretty unique gimmick of having Robin Williams portrayed as a CGI monkey to sort of symbolize how he's always felt like an outcast party animal throughout most of his life.
Snow White came out in March. So let's go to that specific month and see what were the notable titles that came out. We had Mickey 17, Novocaine, Black Bag, and Looney Tunes The Day the Earth Blew Up, which is really good and underrated, by the way. For those who love animation, I suggest you guys check it out.
So you went out of your way once again to watch Snow White, a movie that already looked bad from the marketing, and instead of watching something like, I don't know, Looney Tunes The Day the Earth Blew Up, a much better movie that was also in theaters around this exact time.
And later, the Minecraft movie,
It is a mid-movie.
The Minecraft movie, Even the films.
The Minecraft movie is mid, yes.
But you know what else came out in April that wasn't mid? Sinners. Alright, you don't care about it.
But again, that came out in April, and you know what else came out in April? Sinners, which you yourself admitted you didn't see before.
So that's what I was able to find in about 2 hours of looking. I wanted to get this out immediately and see OtterlyNoah's response before I look any deeper. Other than that, thanks for watching.
And I can see why Vincent might think I plagiarism as well. That definitely was, like, I didn't mean to come off that way.
Creators, it's not like it's coming off, it's like, that's what you did, right? It's not about coming off at all. I mean, you did just, like, steal his points.
Yes, that is 100%, okay, that is completely valid there.
In this specific case, OtterlyNoah has a beat-for-beat recreation of Vincent's video. This is shameless. And again, you can see his chat in real time realize what is happening. Noah again admits that he plagiarized Vincent in a beat-for-beat recreation of his video. Shortly after this, the streamer Dickers asks Noah an important question, and his response is damning for his reputation.
Those are the four examples we've brought up, and we've been correct on every single one of them. And you've taken the L on all of them, right?
Absolutely.
So the question is,
have you taken stuff that you want to
not that I can think off the top of my head.
Okay. Because you realize the problem is, unless the Shamu stuff came from Shamu being told by other people, and then Shamu went and noticed it. Nicandros just went and looked at your Nux video and found very similar results. I think another creator has gone and noticed that that is also taken from them. The last one is from Royal's research, and it's very, very hard, right, to go and look at somebody's channel, look at somebody's videos, and then find the exact other video that they've plagiarized their talking points from, if they have, right? So the fact you've got 4 against you, how are people supposed to be able to trust that your videos are, like, original?
That, well, I don't know, I guess, yeah, all right, whatever.
Frank, you need a kid alone. He's still breathing. Still breathing. Leave him alone. Frankie.
That's right. When asked how much of his content has been lifted from other YouTubers this entire time, OtterlyNoah does not know. These were not just 1 or 2 instances. The very way Noah goes about making his videos leads him to plagiarize almost as a habit. It's part of his workflow, as he will just scour YouTube for ideas and other people's scripts simply to just put them in his own video. He can't even defend himself when Dickers asks if his videos are original. My god, and people still take this guy seriously. If you're still wondering why somebody who has built his channel on criticizing others for making bad content and quote-unquote grifting still has an audience after being exposed as a plagiarist, well, it was never about that in the first place. It has all just devolved into politics. Because Noah has the correct politics, and he is against those who have the wrong politics, any error he makes can be quickly forgiven. This is further supported by the fact that he tried to smear all the people in the call against him as conservative to gain support from his audience, which he admitted to.
Yeah, I think it's kind of evident that that was the case, Noah, because like you were also posting in your like chat, oh guys, these guys are all like conservatives, and I think you would realize,
yeah, because aren't you?
You would have like your audience would have like, because your audience are like, I presume, lefties and all that stuff, right? So that they would have some sort of like they would be a bit more antagonistic towards them if they think they're conservatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you retarded?
As a side note, most of the guys on the call were from Europe, so the idea of even trying to apply an American understanding of liberal and conservative makes no sense. But I doubt OtterlyNoah is even able to conceptualize that possibility. The saga does not end here, however. Dickers made the observation that even Vincent publicly reached out to him in December of 2025 and Noah ignored it. Although Noah states that he would have liked it if people reached out to him before, they already did and he ignored it.
No, I did not see this from him, although, again, if I had, I would have addressed it then. I'm glad to address it now, and if Vincent wants to talk as well, I am more than happy to talk to him.
Okay. I just don't believe when you say that you're fine if people reach out to you beforehand. You're fine taking the L. I don't think that's true. I think people have publicly atted you on Twitter. I think people have sent you DMs on Twitter. I don't know what difference like writing you an email would make. I think that you saw this tweet and you ignored it.
That you can believe that, but that's not true. And I didn't see Shamu's DM either. So
What's even more is KinoFlex went onto Noah's livestream and asked Noah about my observation of him plagiarizing Pillar of Garbage.
I received a DM from someone, so I'm just going, like, requesting that I ask you a question. And
yeah,
if you didn't know that you unconsciously lifted other or repeated other people's points in your videos, do you think it's possible that you repeated like a point from Pillar of Garbage for your What is a Grifter video?
What?
Ooh.
Well, if you want to make a video on that, Kino, go ahead, buddy.
I never said I'm gonna make a video, but I'm just asking if it's possible.
You can, if you want to make a video on that, go ahead. Or like if that's
Oh, dude, that's a yes. That's a yes. He knows he's fucking raped on this point. He knows people have fucking got him. Oh my god, dude.
There is no end to Noah's plagiarism. Hell, while I was making this video, Ryle Kinhouse dropped another video exposing more instances of Noah's plagiarism. This time, his response to Jester Bell's Supergirl trailer reaction is him just ripping off the YouTuber SK. By the end, Ryle Kinhouse states that trying to uncover more of Noah's plagiarism is a useless endeavor. There is truly no account of how deep the well of Noah's plagiarism goes. Noah's actual apology regarding the situation after this live stream is still somehow terrible. In his video titled Moving Forward, he whitewashes his mistakes and states that he will do better at citing sources and that was mostly the extent of his wrongdoing. You can see his community try to claim that this was the extent of his wrongdoing just underneath his video.
These videos did not have their sources cited correctly, and the sources were as follows here. Vincent Parvel's video for the Jester Bell video talking about her takes on 2025 movies, Shamu's Tectone video featured in the Anti-Woke Religious Gamers video and his clip edits of Tectone, and Neryl, whose footage of aliens and True Lies on 4K were used in my Disney and OpenAI video. I absolutely made a mistake, and I want to apologize, and I will cite every single video source properly in my videos going forward. Because the reality is, something did happen here. There were 3 examples of works not being properly cited in my videos, and those are mistakes I want to make sure can never happen again. I am hoping adopting this method of video making going forward will help not only everything get properly cited, but also just ensure I can create better content for everyone in the future, myself included.
The major problem with all of this, Noah was already confronted on this exact point before his apology video. After his original disastrous livestream ended, he went on to Cope and Seed's stream, in which even more revelations were uncovered.
I'm just going to be really honest with you, because I'm kind of crashing out here watching this unfold. I can see comments in your chat when this was going on where it was like, oh, am I being gaslighted? To be clear, man, this isn't just bad research, like especially the video that's like the comparative video. That is a line, that is beat for beat lifting. This is the sort of thing that, like, you know, has ended a lot of people.
He has already admitted to plagiarizing on what gets him the most views, his Griftly Bears series.
Okay, well, while you do research generally, walk me through your research process.
Normally what I do, it depends on the kind of video. If it's an anti-woke, like, grifter video, right? If I'm looking at someone, like, say, like the Nuxtaku video, right? Where I'm talking about him, like, lying about African history blatantly. If I do that, then, like, I'm going to be looking at different texts about African history, different articles, stuff like that, right? Talking about the history of that whole thing.
Okay.
Basically, that's like how, yeah.
But when you're doing the additional stuff with ongoing stories, is there, like, I mean, you're obviously looking at other video essays, right?
In fact, it's even worse. Noah admitted that he was changing things just enough to try to get away with doing a beat-for-beat recreation.
Where you've got literally, you know, you're using the same wording, or there's the joke where it's like a joke about Palpatine.
Yeah, the Emperor Palpatine joke, right? I assumed since I'd, you know, added in my own, like, thing about it looking like Emperor Palpatine and Donald Trump, instead of just saying, like, he's going, like, what did Neryl say? Like, going through the, like, stages of Emperor Palpatinism. I thought that was, you know, different enough to not be plagiarism, but that obviously wasn't the case.
Sure, but I suppose the thing is, it's like, well, you're, in some ways, I don't know if that's better, because you're like, okay, cool, well, I like that line, so I need to change it just enough so it'll get past the audience. I mean, that's almost an acknowledgement that, you know, there's an issue there, right?
That's definitely valid.
The crux lies here, where Noah was directly confronted that citing people is not enough for what he did.
And that one, I did copy, I did say very similar things in word for word, so yeah, I'll take the L off that version.
I mean, it's the timeline of this as well.
Yes.
Yeah, it is literally the flow of that section.
Yes, and that was, yes, and I did not cite him at all, and that was wrong.
I mean, even if you had cited him, to be clear, even if you had cited him, it would still be a problem for something like that, because that is just, I mean, like you may as well have just taken his section of the video and put it in your own. Like recording basically word for word, beat for beat, somebody else's content like that, even if you're citing, is still kind of egregious.
That's very, that makes sense.
Essentially, Noah will capitulate when confronted, but later on will minimize the situation as just citing sources, rather than admitting to wholesale lifting people's videos beat for beat. The way this guy acts, the way he speaks, he's not an otter, he's a weasel. Weasley Noah. There we go. It's far more accurate. And one last observation. Almost every single instance of Noah plagiarizing has come from his Griftly Bears series. This series is one of his most prolific on the channel. It gets him views, the most engagement, and a lot of money. There does not seem to be instances of plagiarism in his autism videos or film reviews. He might be able to discuss autism and film as a topic. However, when trying to argue against quote-unquote grifters, he has to resort to plagiarism, because he can't argue himself. Almost all of the examples come from the Griftly Bears series. Weasley Noah has engaged in egregious plagiarism when he's making videos trying to argue against others. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the guy who's calling other people Griftly Bears. Pathetic. If anyone is grifting, it's Noah.
Because I mean, like, to be clear, from the position of the stuff you've made, you know, I know you've got criticisms for, I think you called like Critical Drinker a grifter, but I mean, to be clear, and this is not in defense of Critical or anything else, it's more just the fact of, well, right now I don't think Critical has ever had an accusation of plagiarism against him, and if somebody's going to, you know, comparing the two, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on you grifting than someone like Critical, right?
Wait, and like instead of like, you know, okay, that's like instead of like exposing like Critical Drinkers grift is what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, because you're calling out somebody else for grifting, while you yourself have not actually like have lifted sections of your content, and that's you know that's because what that looks like again is I want to get a video out on a popular topic. I can see something else is popular or something else is good. I'm just going to replicate that for the views.
That's very okay. I understand that.
At this point, after everything, I really do not understand how anyone could take him seriously as a media critic moving forward. He has been shown to just straight up lie about other reviewers and critics on the platform, where he will state people only review mainstream media when that's not the case, or state certain reviewers do not mention certain points in their videos when they actually do. He consistently has weak criticism. He will oftentimes talk about the correct way to review media, only to deliver the flimsiest criticism that barely scratches the surface of what's actually wrong with any film or show. He is a plagiarist who has shamelessly lifted other people's work who are more talented than him to make one of his highest viewed video series while putting in a fraction of the effort. But don't worry, he said he was sorry, so that's all done and dusted now. Back to the 100th video complaining about Drinker or Nerdrotic. Remember, grifters are people selling you a narrative to get you consistently outraged for views. However, making your 20th video on the Drinker to feed an audience your own brand of outrage for views, well, that's just honest critique. It's only through building an audience that cares more about politics has he been able to survive. If his audience actually cared about consistent standards, then Noah would easily be the worst in the space, but they don't. It's for this very reason that friends of Noah have not levied meaningful criticism towards him, even though calling out bad media critics or grifters is what they do. If it's not obvious at this point, Weasley Noah is a bottom-tier content creator. To get through any semblance of a point, you have to wade through a mound of shitty arguments. And even after all that, if you do take the time and effort to wade through his content to find the kernel of any substantive point, you can't even be sure it's actually his thoughts and not someone else's that he just plagiarized. In the spectrum of media critics you can find on YouTube, OtterlyNoah is squarely at the bottom.
You're fucking retarded.